Chapter 482. The main reason is because of Fu Baogua. Han Sanha said faintly. Because of Fu Baogua? Zhang Ge was even more confused by the answer. Even if Fu Baogua was skilled in strategy and tactics, how could he be worthy of his teacher's attention? If Fu Baogua didn't live up to his reputation, or if he didn't perform so well, our army would have trampled Yutong a long time ago. Han Sanha chuckled bitterly. In this battle, you've only seen how I've sent countless Dongxian soldiers to the battlefield without regard for the cost. Do you know who are the ones who have died in this battle? Let me tell you now, other than some of the generals in the military, most of them. A mocking smirk hung on Han Sanha's face. You can even say that the armed forces of the many families in Dongxian have all been buried under the Fortress of Resilience in the previous war. After this war, Dongxian will be unusually easy to govern. Even if we lose this war, more than 80% of the internal threats in Dongxian will be wiped out by me. A hint of coldness flashed across Han Sanha's face. However, whether we win or lose this war, as long as I return to the country, I won't have another chance to lead an army for the rest of my life. So, do you still think that there's a problem with what I said just now? As long as Fu Baogua survives this war, he'll really be the next top general in Tianxian. Those families who have suffered heavy losses will never let me go. His Majesty will have to give them an explanation for the balance of power in the country. As the person directly involved, I'll be the scapegoat. It's inevitable. It's also because of this reason that I can't retreat. Qiu Jianhan and Fu Baogua have come here with the intention to die. But what they don't know is that I, Han Sanha, feel the same way. As a soldier, dying on the battlefield is much more honorable than dying on a sickbed or being attacked by a political enemy. This land that's soaked in blood, other than being Qiu Jianhan's home, is also the home that I long for. As for why this war has to go on, how can I not know that the time, place, and people aren't on our side? But as long as I'm still fighting, the country can only choose to support me. On the other hand, if we retreat now, I will be imprisoned in the country until I die of old age. I might even be punished for my defeat, and my family will be exterminated. I might even be beheaded on the spot. Originally, these were still limited to me. Dongxian still has all of you. Even if I let go, even if I am worried, this is all I can do. But you have to know that there's another disadvantage if we retreat. Yutong will have 2 more invincible marshals, and 2 more qualified marshals, who are slightly inferior to them, but not by much. Although Yutong is surrounded by enemies on all sides, and is weak, Yutong's military will reach unprecedented heights because of this. Taizheng, Fu Baogua, Lung of the South, Wang of the West, the commanders-in-chief of the 4 borders. All of them are the cream of the crop. How can our countries surpass them? Among the 4 generals, Taizheng is the publicly acknowledged invincible marshal in the continent. Such a character is actually inferior to Fu Baogua, because Fu Baogua is an all-rounder and more importantly, Fu Baogua is Fang Qingtian's disciple. Of course, Taizheng's impulsive personality has also determined this. Although Fu Baogua is considered a qualified marshal, he isn't invincible. If he were to face Taizheng head-on, the chances of him winning would only be 50-50. Taizheng's chances of winning might even be slightly higher. However, after this war, Fu Baogua's various abilities have been matured. Whether it's bravery, tenacity, ambushing, forbearance, tenacity, ruthlessness, he has reached the pinnacle of a general in all aspects. Han Sanha's voice was filled with emotion. Fu Baogua has been thoroughly trained, but all of you are far from it. If I were to retreat from this war and disappear, when Yutong reorganizes its army to fight again in the future, all of you will definitely not be Fu Baogua's or Taizheng's opponents. By then, be it Dongxian, Zio, or the gift of great primordial spirit, they will all be trampled by Yutong's iron hooves. It can even be said that the 9 Supremes' help is not the main point. Zhang Ge said indignantly. I don't think so, do I? Han Sanha smiled faintly and said, do you know that Fu Baogua has a secret troop called the Serving Troop? Have you seen Fu Baogua use this troop before? Zhang Ji's expression changed. No. Does such a troop really exist? Han Sanha said, there is. Yutong's steel cavalry is known as Yutong's invincible lion. When Taizheng left the eastern defense, He left a total of 150,000 men behind. From the start of the war until now, how many steel cavalry have you seen? Jean Gu calculated and said, the steel cavalry this disciple has seen, there are about 120 to 30,000 of them. 120 to 30,000? Han Sanha shook his head. You've only seen 50,000 of them. Jean Gu was indignant. How is that possible? And those steel cavalry who have been harassing us, how many troops are there? How many of them? Where are they? Do you know? Those steel cavalry belong to those I've never seen before. Those steel cavalry are scattered in the dark. Do you know what those people have done other than harassing us? Han Sanha asked. Jean Gu was at a loss. What? Han Sanha sighed. The steel cavalry that Fu Baogua had sent out never appeared, even when the Fortress of Resilience was at its most dangerous, let alone providing aid. It's obvious that these people have strict orders that forbid them from getting involved in anything other than their mission. If I'm not wrong, even if we had breached the Fortress of Resilience that day, those steel cavalry still wouldn't have appeared. They would have only turned into an eternal threat to Dongxian. If Fu Baogua had used either of these two troops, the steel cavalry and the serving troop, I would have had absolute confidence in taking down the Fortress of Resilience. However, these two troops have never really appeared. Their purpose is, Han Sanha said word by word, to keep our shadow cavalry here, not daring to move. Jean Gu was hit with a sudden realization. Fu Baogua's trump card is also my trump card. When the advantages and disadvantages of both sides are clear, it's a battle of who is bolder, more meticulous, and more daring. Fu Baogua has been able to fight until now when his overall ability is at a disadvantage. Han Sanha squinted and sighed softly. He's truly qualified to fight me head-on on the battlefield. Jean Gu was shocked. His teacher had never given anyone such a high evaluation, not even Taizheng back then. He did not expect Fu Baogua, who had been beaten to the brink of death, to receive such a high evaluation. Therefore, this battle can't end here. Even if it does, Fu Baogua must be killed first. Han Sanha said, leaving Taizheng alone. As long as we target his weakness, there's room for maneuver. But Fu Baogua must die. As long as there's no Fu Baogua on the eastern border, the empire of Dongxian can live on for another 300 years. Zhang Jiyi's heart skipped a beat as he suddenly said, but the other countries? The other countries? Han Sanha chuckled mockingly. The empire of Ziyou is doomed after this incident. The empire of Deyuan is scared out of its wits by Supreme Cloud. Shen Xiai of the north is already at its limit when faced with Taizheng's ferocious attacks. It doesn't even have the strength to retaliate. What other countries are there? Han Sanha snorted heavily. The one who unifies the world in the future will be either Dongxian or Yutong. There won't be a third country that can lay a finger on the entire Tianxian continent's bountiful land. Zhang Gu was shocked. It turned out that Yutong held such a high position in his teacher's heart. He subconsciously raised his hawk-eye to look at the Fortress of Resilience. Suddenly he cried out, "Teacher, they're moving!" Han Sanha said faintly, "Have they started splashing water on the wall?" Zhang Gu nodded. "Yes, they're splashing water." Suddenly his expression changed. "Teacher, it's obvious that they're trying to make use of the frigid weather to turn the water into ice. Then the wall will become impenetrable. Even if there's a mark, a basin of water will be poured over it, and it will recover immediately. It might even be more secure. How can we fight this battle?" Han Sanha smiled faintly. This is Qiu Jinhan's last resort. It seemed that this old man was also at a loss for what to do with that gap. "I have no choice but to use the frozen city move." He turned and descended the mountain, saying faintly, "It's a pity that he doesn't know that this is what I've been waiting for." Zhang Gu was confused. Facing an impenetrable fortress like this, what other countermeasures did his teacher have? Chapter 483. The Fortress of Resilience was closed. Fu Baogua's eyes, which had initially been muddy and dull, were now radiant. He watched as buckets of water were poured down, slowly turning into solid ice in the frigid weather. It was as if a layer of armor had been added to the fortress wall. As the process repeated, an hour later, the entire outer layer of the Fortress of Resilience's wall had an additional layer of ice. It was a crystalline slippery, but unusually sturdy wall. All the damages on the Fortress of Resilience's wall were covered by the layer of ice. There were no longer any gaps. Fu Baogua touched it excitedly and slashed it with his sword, testing the new wall's sturdiness with his own hands. Snow and ice flew everywhere from the slash, but the main body of the wall did not show any signs of damage. Although the ice wall's sturdiness was slightly inferior, it could still be used. Most importantly, such an ice wall could be easily repaired even if it was damaged. A few buckets of water could be poured over it, and the repair would be completed after a short wait. Great idea! What a great idea! Fu Baogua was trembling, his eyes gleaming as he guffawed. Old Marshall's idea is truly a stroke of genius. Why didn't I think of such a good idea before? Han Sanha. I'd like to see how many lives Han Sanha has to fill up this Fortress of Resilience. Don't destroy the ice wall. Don't destroy the ice wall. In spite of this, Qiu Jianhan's expression was completely different from Fu Baogua's delight. Old Marshal Qiu's expression was somber, his gaze worried. He looked like he had a lot on his mind. Fu Baogua asked in surprise, "Why is old Qiu like this? The Fortress of Resilience is like an iron wall now. Even if Han Sanha has 3 heads and 6 arms, it'll be hard for him to shake it. With such an ice wall, even if he damages the outside today, it'll only take a night at most to recover to its original state. The Fortress of Resilience will be impregnable, and we can rest easy." Qiu Jianhan chuckled humorlessly. "I wouldn't be surprised if someone else thought so, but you, Fu Baogua, shouldn't have thought so." Fu Baogua was taken aback. He was an intelligent man, a commander who knew his soldiers well. He immediately thought that the old marshal's ice wall tactic should have some sort of limitation. But what was it? While he was delighted, he had also thought about the drawbacks of this tactic, but he had never thought of a way to break it. It was because he had put himself in his shoes that he was so delighted. Was there something that he had missed out on? Qiu Jianhan's expression darkened when he saw Fu Baogua's contemplative expression. He said, "Baogua, order the logistics department to prepare more kerosene and fire arrows." He especially had to prepare a large amount of water to prevent Han Sanha from attacking them with fire in the ensuing battle. Then, order the steel cavalry and the serving army to conserve their strength and be ready to fight to the death. After saying that, he went down worriedly. Fire attack? Fu Baogua was still puzzled by the old marshal's words. Water and fire countered each other. This was a simple truth that everyone knew. When he had put himself in the ice wall's shoes to come up with a strategy, he had considered using fire as well. But to use fire against an ice wall at this time of the year, it was easier said than done. That was why he had rejected the idea, when he had only thought of the beginning. What was the old marshal talking about in such a serious manner? Besides, even if the other party were to attack with fire, he could still prepare a large amount of water and sand. But why did he have to prepare kerosene and fire arrows as well? Was he afraid that the other party's fire was not strong enough and would only add fuel to the fire? This order was getting more and more mysterious and unexpected. Fu Baogua could not help but let his imagination run wild. It looked like there was still a considerable gap between him and the famed marshal back then. He needed to continue working hard. Fu Baogua was still thinking about this as he followed Qiu Jianhan down the wall. He could not figure out where he had misjudged the situation. It was at this moment that he heard a commotion in front of him. Looking towards the source of the voice, 12 sturdy young men, who looked like 12 calves, were arguing with several old soldiers. The argument had even turned into physical contact. The leader of the group was currently struggling until his face was flushed red. He shouted with all his might, "We are only looking for a person. How can we violate the law? We're all Yutong's people. What right do you have to treat us like this?" The veteran who was holding the youth grinned menacingly. "Insolence. You have no respect, and your mouth is filled with disrespectful words. Who else should we take if not you? You've not only broken the law, you've committed an unpardonable crime." The youth looked aggrieved. "Who have I disrespected? We're really here to join the army and serve our country. The 12 of us are here to fight against Dongxian. How are we unpardonable? We're not spies. Open your eyes and take a good look. We're all Yutong's people." Qiu Jianhan and Fu Baogua heard it from afar and exchanged a glance, their hearts filled with suspicion. Go over and have a look, Fu Baogua ordered his janissaries. As for Fu Baogua and Qiu Jianhan, they would not go over personally, no matter how confused they were. This was a critical and sensitive period. What if the other party was really a spy and both of them were assassinated? Even if the assassination was not successful, such an incident would cause the already unstable morale of the army to waver once more. The morale of Yutong's army, that had just been stabilized, could not be shaken by such an incident. A few of the janissaries walked over and clarified the current situation with just a few words. The process of the incident was actually very simple. The 12 youths who claimed to be here to join the army each had a fine warhorse with them, and their equestrian skills were impressive. The cavalry general was naturally delighted to see them. Even the steel cavalry general's eyes shone when he saw them. Of course, the most pleasant surprise was still the 12 warhorses. Every single one of them was an extremely fine colt. Especially a few of the warhorses. They were all over 8 m in length, had long legs, and were extremely strong and vigorous horses of the highest quality. They did not need much training. Only a little training was needed for them to be the vanguard of the battlefield. The cavalry general, who loved horses as much as his life, went forward to chat, wanting to recruit the youths. This group of youths were all children from remote mountain villages. Each of them was simple and honest. When they were asked, they blushed. Everyone roared with laughter and liked them even more. Soldiers who had been on the battlefield for a long time preferred honest, simple, and honest youths over smart kids. However, this fondness stopped when one of the children asked curiously, "May I ask, big brothers, there's another important matter for us to do here. We need to find a few people and send a letter to them." An old soldier smiled and said, "Who are you looking for? Tell us. Even if we don't know, we'll ask around for you. I believe there will be news very soon." The teenager said dumbly, "There are 3 people who can receive the letter. One is called Qiu Jianhan, another is called Fu Baogua, and the last one is called Shengguan Lingxiu, a female general. Any one of these 3 will do." As soon as these names came out, the entire place fell into a strange silence. Many of the battle-hardened veterans in the surroundings no longer looked at the group of teenagers with friendliness in their eyes. Instead, they were filled with murderous intent. Many pairs of calloused hands quietly touched the hilts of their sabers. How bold! It was only their first day joining the military, but they were already asking about old Marshal Qiu, Marshal Fu, and the Shengguan family of generals. Not only were they bold, but their ulterior motives were obvious. Thinking deeper, these 12 youths looked simple and honest, but each of them had a top-notch precious horse. This in itself did not match the image of them coming from the countryside. It was obvious that there was a big problem. One of the officers sneered and said faintly, "May I ask who asked you to look for these 3 people?" The teenager scratched his head and said, "It's our teacher. Before we left, our teacher wrote us a letter and asked us to pass it to one of these 3 people, no matter who it is." The officer's tone was even more hostile. "Your teacher? Who's your teacher? Could it be that he knows any one of the 3 people you mentioned just now?" The sarcasm in his tone was no longer concealed. It was blatant mockery. "How dare your teacher claim to know the 3 sirs? Even if he only knew any one of them, it was all nonsense." The teenager did not hear the officer's mockery. Just as he was about to reply, he was suddenly at a loss for words. He stammered, I can't say. I can only say it after I see these 3 people." The officer smirked. "You can't say? Very well. Since you can't say it, men, take down these spies." The veterans were already prepared for this. They swarmed forward at once, intending to capture all of the teenagers in front of them. Unexpectedly, the skills of these little fellows were extremely slippery, and they were not to be trifled with. Even when they were surrounded by the joint forces of so many veterans, they were still able to attack and defend, and were not at a disadvantage at all. It could even be seen that they did not want to injure others. Otherwise, those veterans would have most likely died in the hands of these little fellows, because they had underestimated them from the beginning. However, when they observed the details of their attacks, The officers were even more enraged. This was a life-saving technique that only veterans who had been through hundreds of battles would possess. Where did these teenagers learn it from? Was there even a need to ask? There was no room for discussion about their ill intentions. Take them down. Take them all down. Kill anyone who resists. What are you doing? We've been merciful, okay? We're really here to look for someone. There's really a letter. We only asked for Qiu Jianhan and Fu Baogua's names. What crime have we committed? The officers were even more enraged. F***CK. You've already exposed yourselves. Yet you still dare to play dumb in front of your father. Did I ask you to show mercy? Just as the general was about to give the order to kill, a stern voice suddenly rang. Stop. Chapter 484. Old Marshal, be careful of Han San's trick. Fu Baogua was shocked. Don't worry. Qiu Jianhan was assured. With Bai Yixue and Fang Mafei protecting him at close range, there were not many people in this world who could kill him with a single blow. Not to mention a few half-grown kids. Based on the current situation, the teenagers had indeed shown mercy, and there was no sign of them lying. What kind of person was old Marshal Qiu? Naturally, he would not take things for granted like the veterans. The so-called flaw in their hearts would not be a flaw at all. A true spy would wish that they could conceal themselves to the point that there was nothing special about them. Why would they come in a group of teenagers, bringing along a dozen fine horses, and calling out their target's name directly? It was even more bizarre and illogical. This old man is the Qiu Jianhan you're looking for. Old Marshal Qiu looked at the children with a smile. Who asked you to look for me? Where's the letter? It was still the leader of the teenagers who asked suspiciously. You say that you're Qiu Jianhan, but what proof do you have? You're the boss of these bad guys, we don't believe you. This sentence was a stroke of genius. Qiu Jianhan was stunned. Yes, I say that I'm Qiu Jianhan, but what proof do I have? Fu Baogua could not help chuckling as he strode out and said, I'm the Fu Baogua you're looking for. Do you need proof too? The children in front of him said blankly. Of course proof. What right do you have to say that you're Fu Baogua? We've just said that we're looking for the both of you, and the both of you have come out. How can there be such a coincidence in this world? Do you think we're fools? Fu Baogua was speechless. Qiu Jianhan said, amused. This old man has roamed the world for so many years, and no one has ever asked for proof of identity when they see me. This is an eye-opener for this old man today. At this moment, the soldiers beside them bowed respectfully. Greetings, old Marshal Qiu. Greetings, Marshal Fu. The teenagers were shocked, their heads spinning as if they were dreaming. This. Qiu Jianhan is actually a marshal? Fu Baogua is also a marshal? Is that Miss Shengguan also a grand marshal? Aye. The 12 youngsters were thrown into confusion in the wind. They were completely dumbfounded. A few of them paled. They still did not know who Qiu Jianhan and Fu Baogua were. But they knew that the marshal was a high-ranking official. At least, this official was the highest in the Eastern Fortress of Resilience. All right. This old man is getting more and more interested in knowing who your teacher is. Now that it has been proven, can the letter be taken out? Qiu Jianhan guffawed. He had not seen Qiu Jianhan like this for the past few days. These children were a rare source of joy. Fu Baogua, who was also doubted, was amused as well. The letter is here. The teenager was flustered. He untied his cotton-padded jacket and put his hand into his underwear. After fumbling for a long time, he finally took out a small bag that was tightly wrapped in animal skin. He opened them layer by layer, and there was a letter inside. One of Qiu Jianhan's janissaries took a step forward and took the letter, turning to pass it to Qiu Jianhan respectfully. Qiu Jianhan took the letter and opened it absent-mindedly as he asked, Who is your teacher? What is his surname? Why is it so weird? The teenager answered respectfully. Teacher said that his surname is Yun. Qiu Jianhan's hand that was opening the letter froze. A sharp glint shot out of his eyes. Where is your teacher now? As he blurted out this question, an uneasy feeling suddenly surged in his heart. Then he stuffed the letter into his robe and said urgently, Everyone here, follow this marshal to the marshal's tent and bring these children here. Martial law is to be enforced in the entire city. No one is to act recklessly. Those who act recklessly will be dealt with according to military law. Then he took the lead and strode away. Fu Baogua shuddered as well, catching up quickly. His expression was unprecedentedly stern. There was no trace of a smile on his face. The few children were escorted by a group of military officers and generals as they came to the marshal's tent in fear and confusion. Qiu Jianhan finished reading the letter in unusual detail. His eyes glowed as he looked at the children in front of him. Other than this letter, did your teacher say anything else? The letter that old Marshal Qiu had placed so much emphasis on did not reveal any information at all. It probably only asked Qiu Jianhan and Fu Baogua to take care of these children. There was no information that old Marshal Qiu was really concerned about. Teacher said that. He said that he will arrive in half a month at the latest. The children spoke with a tinge of fear, looking at the heavily guarded marshal's tent and the high-ranking generals that came and went. How could they not know that the person that their teacher had asked them to look for was actually such an important figure? It was already a testament to their mental fortitude that they could still speak in one sentence at a time like this. Half a month at the most. Qiu Jianhan and Fu Baogua's eyes glistened when they heard the words, their hearts filled with ecstasy. The way they looked at the children was like they were looking at peerless treasures. Your teacher, how is he now? Qiu Jianhan asked after some thought. He's not doing well. Many of the bones in his body are broken. When we left home, teacher still couldn't stand up. I've never seen anyone with such heavy injuries in my entire life. The leader of the group hesitated for a moment before muttering. Qiu Jianhan's expression turned grim at once. Many of his bones were broken, and he could not stand up. Even a high-level cultivator would find it difficult to recover from such injuries. How could he arrive within half a month? Still, there was news. No news was good news, but it was even better to have news of his survival. What does your teacher look like? Fu Baogua pondered for a moment, and finally asked a question that Qiu Jianhan had been wanting to ask, but dared not ask. The youth was deep in thought, scratching his head so hard that his dandruff fell like snowflakes. After a moment of hesitation he said, "It's really hard to say. Teacher shouldn't be that old. But because his injuries are too severe, we can't see his true appearance. Anyway, he's covered in scars. Injuries aside, he's still very impressive." Fu Baogua was speechless. He might as well not have said it. Should he not have asked just now? Perhaps this was the main reason why the old marshal did not ask this question. "Wang Dinghua," Fu Baogua hollered. "I'll leave these children to you. Take good care of them. Try not to lose any of them." Wang Dinghua agreed. "Let's go." The children said hurriedly, "We don't want to be watched. We're here to fight Han Sanha, to protect the country. What's the big deal about being watched? We've inherited our teacher's teachings. We want to go to the battlefield and earn merit to go home." Fu Baogua laughed. "When did I say that you're not allowed to go to the battlefield? As long as you follow Wang Dinghua, you won't have to worry about not having merit to earn. However, the most important thing on the battlefield is military law. The first thing you have to learn is to obey. You may leave." The few of them obediently went down the stairs. Watching the children leave, Fu Baogua turned to look at Qiu Jianhan and said tentatively, "Old sir, do you think?" Qiu Jianhan frowned as well. "This old man can't be sure either. I dare not say anything." He looked at Fu Baogua meaningfully and said, "But there's one thing I'm sure of, the other party is definitely one of us." Fu Baogua was overjoyed. "Then is it Lord Supreme Cloud?" He could tell that the old marshal was unwilling to delve into this topic, but Fu Baogua was excited and could not help wanting to get to the bottom of it. Qiu Jianhan sighed and said, "That person only said that his surname is Yin, but someone with the surname Yin might not be Supreme Cloud." Fu Baogua was stunned. Since he said that his surname is Yin, who else could it be if not Supreme Cloud? Qiu Jianhan glared at him. There are plenty of ace cultivators with the surname Yin in their names. Other than Supreme Cloud, there's also the Marquis of Heavenly Clouds, the Seven Steps Killer Sword, Yun Xiaoyao, who hasn't shown himself for a long time. Even Yun Xiaoyao's son, Yun Yang, is an ace cultivator with an amazing cultivation method that stands out among Yutong's younger generation. Other than the two of them, only Supreme Cloud is left. Supreme Cloud has always used the identity of Supreme Wind as a cover. So if his surname is really Yin, Supreme Cloud is definitely not the first choice. This teacher Yin is one of the three of them, there's no doubt about it. As for who it is, we'll only know after we come. Fu Baogua could barely contain his excitement as he said, Yes, yes. No matter who comes, it's a good thing. It's just that, forget about young Master Yun Yang. He wouldn't be of much use even if he came. Qiu Jianhan looked at Fu Baogua meaningfully and said slowly, That might not be the case. If young Master Yin were to come, he might not be any less useful than Marquis Yin. He might even be able to produce a stunning effect. Do you think this old man was just saying that he would stand out among Yutong's younger generation? Fu Baogua asked. Could it be that the child is a cultivation genius, and is already stronger than his ancestors? Qiu Jianhan suddenly grew impatient and said, Why are you asking so many questions? If a bastard like you can be stronger than your ancestors, why can't others? Why aren't you going out to watch your troops? Are you always lazing around here? Is this how you're supposed to be a marshal? Scram, scram. Scram, scram quickly. With spittle all over his face, Fu Baogua walked out in a daze as he wiped it off. He could not understand why the conversation had been so harmonious. How had it suddenly turned into a barrage of **T? Could it be that young Master Yin was really capable? Or perhaps he was the one with the surname Yin that old Marshal Qiu was more inclined towards. It was highly possible. After all, the teenagers had said that although their teacher Yun's face could not be seen clearly, he was not old. The Marquis of Heavenly Clouds, Yun Xiaoyao, could not be said to be young. Supreme Cloud's cultivation base was unfathomable, so he should be a little older as well. It seemed that only young Master Yin could be considered young. If that was the case, the hopes that old Marshal Qiu and old Marshal Qiu had pinned on him would be dashed. Marquis of Heavenly Cloud's young Marquis, Yun Yang, was shockingly talented, but he could not be compared to Supreme Cloud. How could a mere Yun Yang compare to the 9 Supremes think tank, Supreme Cloud? They were worlds apart. They could not be mentioned in the same breath. Fu Baogua felt that he seemed to have found the reason for old Marshal Qiu's sudden change of attitude. In the marshal's tent, Qiu Jianhan, who was left alone, looked anxious and doubtful. He paced back and forth, mumbling to himself, Is it you? Is it you? Chapter 485. Today was the last day of the year. Tomorrow belonged to 2018. It had been 7 months since the 1st of June until today. 7 months of updates, 1,530,000 words. On average, 220,000 words per month. On average, 8,000 words per day. Compared to the previous books, this speed was very slow. However, it was not too slow. Thank you everyone for your support for Supremacy in this half a year. We have been together for a long time. Now we're going to celebrate the new year together. I sincerely wish everyone a new year, and a prosperous, smooth and happy year to come. Actually, before writing this book, I have been thinking about something. China's history since ancient times has been a process of dynasties rising and falling to fight for the world. Every hero has shown brilliantly in their own history. For their country, for their people, they have not hesitated to fight. In fantasy novels, sometimes for the sake of pleasure, one can ignore the war of dynasties and only write about the gratifying and vengeful parts. However, I have always thought, do these fantasy protagonists and heroes not have their own countries? Do they not have their own nationality? What have they always believed in? A person can't just eat the food of the world and only think about becoming stronger. Can he? Therefore, I have set up such a protagonist at the beginning of this book. He can be chivalrous, he can be gratifying and vengeful, he can roam the martial world, but he must have his own mission, his own desire to serve his country. He can fight in the martial world for his brothers. He can draw his sword in anger for his lover. However, he can also bleed on the battlefield for his country. They could also charge and break through enemy lines for their own people. Therefore, there is Yin Yang that everyone sees. The passion of the people has never cooled. We have never abandoned the belief of our country and people. I do not want to instill any truth into the people, nor do I want to awaken anything noble. But this is a character that I have always wanted to write about. A story that I have always wanted to write. War scenes are indispensable for such a protagonist. This book has to continue, and I will continue to write it seriously. What I can do is that this story may not be what some readers expect, but this story can make everyone laugh and cry for him. To be able to leave such a few people in everyone's memory long after the book was finished, Lin Sanjiu was shocked. For example, the Nine Supremes. For example, Yutong. For example, the Fortress of Resilience, Qiu Jianhan, Taizheng and Fu Baogua. In the new year, let us work hard together. I will work harder. I wish everyone happiness. Chapter 486. Shangguan Lingxiu had come as well. She walked in with two tall and slender female generals in tow. Old Marshal, I heard that there's a letter for me? Qiu Jianhan was deep in thought when he heard her. Yes, it's here. He took the letter out. Shangguan Lingxiu glanced at it, and was confused as well. Who is this? Old Marshal Qiu glanced at her and said. He said his surname is Yun. Shangguan Lingxiu shuddered. Lord Supreme Cloud? Old Marshal Qiu's gaze fell on Shangguan Lingxiu's face and said, Not necessarily. Shangguan Lingxiu's eyes shone brighter. Is it young Master Yun Yang? Old Marshal Qiu squinted and said, This old man doesn't know. Shangguan Lingxiu smiled and said, It's a good thing no matter who comes. On the other side, Yu Rulan and Ji Lingxi's expressions changed at the same time. Whether it was Supreme Cloud or Yun Yang, it was a good thing. That was true. It was also a good thing for the two girls. If Supreme Cloud were to come, both of them could ask about Supreme Wind from him. In other words, news of Ji Lingfeng. If Yun Yang came, the two girls gritted their teeth, determined to get even with this bastard. However, why was Shangguan Lingxiu so excited? Supreme Cloud's arrival was beneficial to the war. It was only natural for her to be happy. However, what was she happy about Yun Yang's arrival? Qiu Jianhan saw the change in the two girls' expressions and said, These two look unfamiliar. Shangguan Lingxiu introduced with a smile. These two are martial artists highly skilled. Along the way, before she could finish, Yu Rulan had already said faintly, Let old Marshal know. I'm Yu Rulan, and this is my sister-in-law Ji Lingxi. Qiu Jianhan squinted and said, Good name. The old Marshal was a shrewd man. This lady Yu Rulan was not one to speak much, a gentle and quiet girl. There must be a reason for her to speak first. Therefore, the old Marshal did not interrupt and waited quietly. As expected, Yu Rulan said, My sister-in-law is young Master Yun Yang's fiancée. Supreme Wind's younger sister and fiancée could not be mentioned now. However, Yun Yang was young Master Yun's fiancée. The three of them were shocked when they heard this. Qiu Jianhan's eyes were as round as saucers, while Shangguan Lingxiu turned around abruptly. Even Ji Lingxi herself was blushing at once. Sister Lan, what nonsense are you talking about? Ji Lingxi was rather perplexed as well. When did I become that guy's fiancée? Sister Lan was just spouting nonsense. Yu Rulan remained expressionless. Both she and Ji Lingxi had disguised their faces, so no one would be able to tell even if they were moved. He spoke slowly. This young Master Yin is rather insensible, leaving us in Tiantang City and disappearing without a trace. We have come to look for him. But in his heart, he was exasperated at her for failing to live up to his expectations. Sister, oh sister, you're so silly. Can't you see that this female general's feelings for Yun Yang are almost undisguised? If you continue to be embarrassed, Yun Yang might be snatched away by someone else. Yun Yang's fiancé? Shangguan Lingxiu asked in a daze. Qiu Jianhan frowned and asked suddenly, How many fiancés does Yun Yang have? This old man has discussed with old Mistress Shangguan a few days ago, and has already betrothed Lady Shangguan Lingxiu to Yun Yang. Why is there two fiancés now? As the military's pillar, Qiu Jianhan was naturally on Shangguan Lingxiu's side. He was old and experienced. He could tell from Shangguan Lingxiu's words and actions. He could also tell that Yu Rulan's words were meant to strike Shangguan Lingxiu down. Therefore, he could not help but chime in. You're so good at lying. This old man has lived for a lifetime. Am I inferior to you? Ji Lingxi's expression changed. Is there such a thing? Yu Rulan looked at Qiu Jianhan and said, Old Marshal must be joking. Qiu Jianhan glared at her. This is a military camp, there's no joking here. Get out, all of you. This old man's solemn martial tent has become a place for jealousy. What a scandal! With a wave of his hand he chased them all out. When Shangguan Lingxiu came out, she looked at Ji Lingxi and Yu Rulan. She had so many questions that she could not ask or speak. Ji Lingxi lowered her head as well, occasionally glancing at Shangguan Lingxiu. She could not help but feel that in terms of looks, she might be slightly better than Shangguan Lingxiu. But in terms of height, long legs, and heroic bearing, she could not compare. Yu Rulan had already planted a nail in Shangguan Lingxiu's heart. In addition, the three ladies had been rather close along the way, so Yu Rulan did not provoke her further, and kept her mouth shut. The three ladies were silent, coming to a decision in unison. Everything would have to wait until the war was over. Old Marshal Chiu, who had followed them out to watch the show, was greatly disappointed. There was no quarrel, the three ladies walked back. Along the way, they saw groups of wounded soldiers who were bleeding and bandaged, but each of them was brimming with fighting spirit, their eyes filled with the determination to die. It was as if the brutal battlefield had only given them fearlessness and bravery, not the slightest bit of fear. Yu Rulan and Ji Lingxi were shaken as they watched Yutong's warriors shed their blood on the battlefield without regret. Suddenly, they seemed to understand why Ji Lingfeng had become supreme wind, and why he would fight to protect this country. It was because these were a bunch of respectable people. What an amiable man. Of course, we're here to join the battlefield. By then the three of us sisters will live and die together. Yu Rulan said. Shangguan Lingxiu smiled faintly and nodded. Thank you. As for the rest, I haven't considered it yet. Ji Lingxi said, unwilling to admit defeat. I haven't considered it either. Shangguan Lingxiu's mood had been heavy, but she could not help but smile when she heard what Ji Lingxi said. For the next 3 days, Dongshuan's camp that was stationed opposite the Fortress of Resilience did not make any moves. They could only watch as Yutong's troops poured bucket after bucket of water onto the top of the fort, allowing the water to seep through the cracks. Fu Baoguo was afraid that the weather was too cold, and the water would freeze before it could seep through completely. So he ordered the soldiers to boil the water and pour it down directly. This way, they could prevent the water from freezing before it could seep through. As for the outside of the fort, they could just pour bucket after bucket of water down without concern. With such hasty actions, the Fortress of Resilience had turned into an ice fortress in just 3 short days. The ice and snow outside had reached a thickness of 2 feet. Even a deicide Bao's close-range attack would not be able to penetrate such a thickness. Siege arrows could still penetrate it, but was there any meaning in using siege arrows to attack the layer of ice? At least, there was not much meaning. With this in mind, Yutong's troops' morale was greatly boosted. The shadow of defeat that had shrouded them previously, and the path of defeat had long vanished. Even the clouds of war that had been suppressed for so long had dissipated at this moment. All of them were filled with confidence towards the victory of this war. Only Qiu Jianhan was still worried every day, his brows furrowed as he repeatedly checked on the fort's reserves and supplies. On the other side, Han Sanhe had been observing Yutong's movements. He saw that the Fortress of Resilience had finally stopped watering the fort after the 3rd day. After all, there was no longer any meaning in continuing to thicken the wall. The current scale was already sufficient. When Dongshuan's troops came to attack, they would bear the brunt of the attack, and pour water on the wall after the battle ended. All of Yutong's soldiers were reassured, but the soldiers on top of the fort could feel the chill. It was a bone-chilling coldness that chilled their hearts to the bone. On the 3rd day, Han Sanhe summoned Zhang Ge. Han Sanhe summoned Zhang Ge and asked, "Have you prepared everything I asked you to prepare?" "They've been prepared for a long time." Han Sanhe's eyes glinted coldly. "Then attack." Just as Han Sanhe announced the attack, Yutong's reinforcements arrived once again. This time there was only one person, a person with the surname Yun, Marquis of Heavenly Clouds, who had not been seen for a long time, had rushed here from the north day and night. Now Marquis of Heavenly Clouds, who had passed the bottleneck of the perfection of the peak realm, and successfully ascended to the heaven realm, had arrived. Fu Baoguo was first overjoyed at Yun Xiaoyao's arrival. Then he felt an indescribable sense of disappointment. F***ck, why did this fellow come? Even if it was his son who had come, this marshal wouldn't be so disappointed. After all, according to Qiu Jianhan's evaluation, Marquis of Heavenly Clouds, Yun Xiaoyao, was the lowest among the 3 Yuns. Qiu Jianhan was not surprised by Yun Xiaoyao's sudden arrival. He asked directly once they met, "How's the north?" Marquis Yun was still very respectful towards old Marshal Qiu as he replied, "The situation in the north is unusually stable. Marshal Taizheng has chosen to take the initiative and lead the army to fight Tianxi. He's won 3 out of 3 battles, his might unprecedented. Currently, Tianxi's troops have retreated 500 miles. Although both sides are currently in a stalemate, I believe there won't be any problems on Marshal Tai's side. The only regret is that Tianxi's troops are still increasing, so Marshal Tai doesn't dare send troops to assist the east." The Marquis of Heavenly Clouds, Yun Xiaoyao, was indeed Yun Yang's father in name. His appearance was equally outstanding. He was tall, handsome, elegant and radiant, giving others a good impression at first sight. This humble one has been staying at the northern border for more than a year. Marshal Tai saw that the war has stabilized and discussed it with this marquis, requesting this marquis to assist alone. Thus, this marquis has traveled south through the night and has finally arrived at the Fortress of Resilience today to contribute my strength. Marquis Yun smiled gently. "I'm not too late after all. I can still make it in time for this war of the century and watch the ultimate showdown between the world's top marshals." Chapter 487. Qiu Jianhan was elated. "Marquis Yun has traveled thousands of miles to aid us. He has been a great help to us. This old man is grateful." Qiu Jianhan knew Marquis Yun's real identity well. Marquis Yun's arrival here was almost equivalent to His Majesty's arrival. No matter what decision Qiu Jianhan made, as long as Marquis Yun was here, Marquis Yun would shoulder the responsibility, even if there were any mistakes afterward. The royal family would never have any suspicions. It was not that the old marshal was overthinking, but it was a method of self-preservation when the need arose. After all, the saying that a general would not obey the emperor's orders when he was away, that his merits would overshadow his master, and that the emperor and his subjects would be suspicious of him, was the chief concern of a marshal. Although old Marshal Qiu was very sure that His Majesty would never suspect him, he still had to be wary of scoundrels in the imperial court. If the war was lost, everything would be over. If the war was won, there would always be people who wanted to reap the fruits of their labor. Regarding this, no matter how wise the ruler was, or how prosperous the world was, there would never be a lack of such people. It was at this time that the war drums on the opposite side suddenly thundered as a shrill horn tore through the sky at the same time. The sudden sound was deafening, and the ground shook because of it. "Dongxian is attacking." Fu Baoguo was rather taken aback when he heard the news that was both reasonable and unexpected. Facing such an impregnable fort, what right did the renowned marshal, Han Sanha, have to launch an attack in broad daylight? Was he out of his mind? Or perhaps he had taken the wrong medicine? No matter how confused he was, Han Sanha's attack was already right before his eyes. Fu Baoguo charged up to the top of the fort in a single breath, and could not help sucking in a cold breath at what he saw. Dongshuan's army was densely packed, carrying long ladders that were as dense as a forest as they charged over. What made Fu Baoguo even more fearful was that he saw Dongshuan's shadow cavalry moving out in full force. They were like a black dragon that swam at high speed, shaking their heads and wagging their tails, ready to bite the enemy. What puzzled Fu Baoguo, or rather, was that there were also quite a number of people carrying long logs and large boulders. Were those not weapons used to defend the fort? Also, what were those people running with half of the ladder doing? Do we need these things to attack a city? Han Sanha's attack was not a joke, was it? Han Sanha's frontline troops pressed forward at the same time, pressing into the center of the battlefield. The 200,000 shadow cavalry that came this time were divided into 2 squads, their left and right flanks glaring at the battlefield like pincers. Follow the arrangement from the day before yesterday. All the archers in the army are to serve. Qiu Jianhan's voice came from behind. The old marshal's voice was unusually somber. We only need the archers to move for now. Han Sanha's purpose this time isn't to attack the city. Not here to attack the city. Fu Baoguo was even more bewildered when he heard this. But in the next moment he understood. Reality told him the answer. The Dongxian soldiers who were gradually approaching the Fortress of Resilience. The first troop to enter the fort marched in a uniform manner. Each of them held a huge shield in one hand, covering their entire body from head to toe, while the other carried a long ladder, held by a few people, as they sprinted over. When this troop arrived at the edge of the Fortress of Resilience, their next step was to erect the ladder on the wall, and turn to leave without a moment's hesitation. Fu Baoguo was still bewildered by the reality before his eyes. What was going on? The ladder had been erected, and they were already at the edge of the fort. Why were they not attacking? Was this another form of cold feet? Release the arrows. As Qiu Jianhan ordered, tens of thousands of arrows were fired from the top of the fort. The arrows were obviously aimed at the soldiers who were erecting the ladders, but the Dongxian troops were already prepared for this. The shields in each of their hands were a few sizes bigger than usual, but the rain of arrows did not cause much damage. There were only a few unlucky fellows who were shot when they lowered the ladders and died under the fort. As the number of rolling logs, boulders, and ladders increased, piling up high, the situation became more and more bizarre. Observing from a close distance, Fu Baoguo realized that the ladders used by Dongxian to attack the fort this time were not ladders, but long ladders. They were placed at the highest point, about 10.5 feet from the top of the fort. The people on the fort could not do anything to these ladders. Although some of the smarter soldiers had already pulled out the flagpoles and guided them to the bottom of the city wall to pull down some of the long ladders, most of the long ladders were only a few feet long and stopped at the height of the middle of the city wall. Even the flagpoles could not reach them. As the cycle continued, the items that Dongxuan's troops had piled up under the fort wall gradually grew thicker and thicker. At a glance, it looked like a gentle slope. With another order from Qiu Jianhan, 5,000 Yutong's steel cavalry charged out of the fort. No matter what, we can't let these things take root under the fort wall. Destroy them all. Seeing that Yutong's steel cavalry had moved out, the shadow cavalry on the other side had sent a troop out almost at the same time to intercept them. When the enemies met again, both sides would naturally engage in a massacre. Most of Dongxuan's troops were indifferent to the situation, as if they did not see it. They only cared about transporting the supplies to the bottom of the fort wall. Later on, even the straw and dried branches were left here. Are they attacking with fire? Fu Baoguo was dumbfounded. Would this work? Of course it's a fire attack. And this is only the first step of Han Sanha's strategy. Qiu Jianhan sighed deeply as he watched the brutal battle between the shadow cavalry and the steel cavalry below the fort worriedly. Han Sanha is indeed a veteran of the battlefield. He has indeed thought of this. The most extreme situation is about to begin. I wonder if the Fortress of Resilience can really hold on for a month? A few moments later, Dongxuan's soldiers who had left all their belongings behind hurriedly retreated. While the battle between the steel cavalry and the shadow cavalry was still going on, a loud horn rang from Dongxuan's camp. A shrill voice hollered, "Light the fire! Fire the arrows!" With a loud boom, Dongxuan's archers were already prepared, lighting up the arrows that had been soaked in kerosene on the bowstring. Swoosh! 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 Countless fire arrows instantly covered the entire sky as they flew towards them. Boom! The base of the fort was ablaze with a towering fire. The sudden heat wave burned Fu Baoguo's face, making him feel like he was at the edge of a sea of fire. In spite of this, Fu Baoguo was still puzzled by Dongxuan's move and Han Sanha's strategy. What's the use of attacking with fire? We only need to retreat from the top of the fort to avoid such a huge fire. But Dongxian can't possibly cross the wall of fire to attack. If they force it, they'll only burn themselves to death with the current fire. Qiu Jianhan sighed. Baoguo, as a general, not only do you need to know your soldiers, the weather, the geography, and so on, there are many other things that you need to know as well. Fu Baoguo's uneasiness grew exponentially. Had he really missed something important? What? What don't I know? Actually, setting fire is only Han Sanha's first move. Dongxuan's army will continue to throw burning things under the fort's walls. Qiu Jianhan sighed. The Fortress of Resilience is known as an impregnable fortress. Other than being impregnable, the weather and geography here are also the key to this fortress's invincibility. Whether it's a flood or fire attack, no attack will be effective. Now that there's a loophole, we can only use ice to solidify the fort. We have to do this. When the water is poured down, it looks like the entire city has been melted into one, making it even more indestructible. However, at the same time, it has also created a considerable amount of hidden dangers. The water has frozen into ice, forming a thick layer of ice. At the same time, it has also filled up the gaps between the stones of the city walls, making these gaps even larger. When the ice melts in spring, the water will leave and return to the ground, but the fort's sturdiness will slowly fade as well. It might even be on the verge of collapse. What Han Sanha is doing is speeding up this process. If the fire can't be stopped, the moment the ice melts completely, it'll be the Fortress of Resilience's doomsday. By then, a single attack will be enough to collapse the flawed areas. Perhaps more than one area will collapse as well. Therefore, this strategy of freezing the fort is only a countermeasure to quench one's thirst with poison. Han Sanha is still trying his best to hasten the poison's effect, accelerating it as much as he can. Qiu Jianhan said. Do you understand now? Fu Baoguo was pale, no longer as calm and collected as he usually was. This extinguished the fire. Qiu Jianhan sighed. The large amount of water that had been prepared beforehand, and countless streams of white water, gushed down the top of the wall and into the burning fire. Tens of thousands of people splashed water at the same time, and there were a few inexhaustible wells in the Fortress of Resilience. However, after a period of stalemate, the monstrous fire was quickly suppressed, leaving only black smoke billowing into the air. At the top of the fort, the steam that rose from the clash of heat and cold almost shrouded the entire top of the fort. As the temperature plummeted, the ice that had been melted by the fire began to solidify again. Fu Baoguo looked over and said, scratching his head, Yes, as long as we extinguish the fire, everything will return to normal. Qiu Jianhan said faintly, How can it return to normal? Look down there. You have me by your side now. How can you lose your usual composure? As a marshal, the most important thing is to remain unfazed even if the mountain collapses in front of you. Fu Baoguo looked down and saw the long ladders that had yet to be completely burnt, especially the rolling logs and rocks that were piled up under the fort. As far as his eyes could see, they had already risen to a certain height. As the fire was extinguished, cold water was splashed down continuously. Other than the rising white smoke, some of the edges had already begun to freeze. What a huge lump. Chapter 488. The steel cavalry tried their best to charge over and destroy the pile of debris beneath the fort, but the shadow cavalry stopped them with equal force. For this reason, they did not hesitate to send out more men than the steel cavalry to stop them. They did not hesitate to fight back with their lives. Qiu Jianhan sighed softly. Retreat. It's impossible to achieve the goal we've set. Han Sanha won't allow this to be destroyed. If we force it to continue, it'll only cause more steel cavalry casualties. Fu Baoguo's expression changed again. However, before Fu Baoguo could give the order, the horn sounded again. Dongxuan's troop was still the same as before, carrying the pile of debris as they charged over. After another pile, the fire rose into the sky once more. More cold water was splashed down from the top of the fort. Later, Qiu Jianhan gave the order to pour cold water over the fire before the other side could fire their rockets. However, after 2 repetitions, Qiu Jianhan gave up on the idea. Not only was it not beneficial, it was harmful instead. The cold water would only further shake the foundation of the Fortress of Resilience. On this day, Dongxuan's troop charged 7 times consecutively. When the sky was about to turn dark, the other side sounded the gong to retreat. Other than the shadow cavalry, all of Dongxuan's troops had retreated. For the rest of the day, Qiu Jianhan's order for the steel cavalry to charge down the fort could not be carried out. However, due to the shadow cavalry's desperate resistance, only one successful charge was made after more than a dozen attempts. The damage done to the pile of debris beneath the fort was minimal. As dusk approached, the weather became even colder. These things that hadn't been completely burned gradually condensed into a ball. If it wasn't for the powerful shockwaves that left no room for destruction, the cavalry's charge would have been powerless. They could only sigh helplessly. It was then that realization finally flashed in Fu Baoguo's eyes. At the same time, an indescribable fear gripped his heart tightly. The so-called exceptional plan, the so-called unbreakable ice city, was actually nothing more than an illusion. Not only were there many hidden dangers, but the enemy could also take advantage of it. Even the most impregnable pass under the heavens would cease to exist because of this unforeseen event. Looking at the pile of debris that had not been burned completely at the base of the fort that stretched for dozens of miles, he felt chills run down his spine. However, all the blood in his body rushed to his head at this moment. In an instant he felt dizzy and saw stars. His body, which had not had enough rest for a long time, almost couldn't hold on any longer. He couldn't help but sway. Do you understand now? The so-called unbreakable ice city is only a temporary measure, a quenching thirst with poison. Qiu Jianhan looked at Fu Baoguo with a dark expression. Fu Baoguo opened his mouth, wanting to speak, but he felt as if there was a piece of burning coal in his throat. It was a burning pain, and he said with difficulty, "I understand. This is Han Sanhe's method, the method of the continent's top general." Qiu Jianhan sighed. The fortress of resilience is destined to fall. I didn't expect that the first time the fortress of resilience fell, it would be in my hands. This is an eternal humiliation, a joke for generations to come. I wonder if I can shoulder it. Fu Baoguo felt a chill run down his spine. His mind was a mess, and he was speechless. Perhaps it was a curse, perhaps it was a nightmare, or perhaps it was a nightmare. In the next 7 days, Yutong and Dongxian continued to repeat the rhythm of attacking the city. The fire started. Water poured down and extinguished the fire. It burned once more and was extinguished once more. The cycle repeated endlessly. The first day's 7 repetitions was actually the day with the least number of repetitions. Everything had a process of familiarizing oneself with it. The saying practice makes perfect actually applied to the current situation as well. The resources that had not been completely burned under the wall increased in number, piling up higher and higher. In the cold weather they could no longer be destroyed. As the slope became more pronounced, small ice mounds were gradually formed. Everyone on the top of the wall had come to a realization, so much so that their expressions were frighteningly grim. By now, there was no longer anyone who did not understand what Han Sanhe was trying to do, and what his ultimate goal was. Perhaps, the Fortress of Resilience's wall would have already been breached the day the weather turned warmer, due to the repeated freezing and burning. The ice mounds formed by the accumulated materials were already enough to build a path to attack the fortress. The accumulated materials had already formed another connection between the Fortress of Resilience and the outside world. The massive manpower, the numerous soldiers, the inexhaustible resources in the surrounding mountains, in addition to the cold weather, all of these factors had helped Han Sanhe's current strategy to achieve his goal. If the hole in the Fortress of Resilience had not appeared, if the damned boulder had not protruded, Han Sanhe's method would not have been needed at all. Yutong would never choose to build the fortress with ice and destroy the wall itself. But now, everything had been rewritten because of that tiny flaw. If you build the fortress with ice, I'll attack with fire. When the entire fortress has turned into ice, I'll start setting fire. To prevent the fortress from collapsing, you have to extinguish the fire. If this continued, the stalemate would last until 2 to 3 months later, when the weather turned warmer, and the Fortress of Resilience would finally be breached. However, Han Sanhe's plan was obviously better. Using the large amount of water that Yutong had poured down, Dongxian had tossed over long ladders, logs and rocks. In addition to the weather, he had turned the fortress into an ice mound that rose high above the ground. Following that, The continuous fire attack and water extinguishing process inevitably caused the ice lump to gradually expand. It became bigger and bigger, taller and taller. Given time, the tall walls of the Fortress of Resilience would be level with the ground that Han Sanha had built, turning into a smooth path for Dongxuan's shadow cavalry to attack. When that time came, the shadow cavalry would no longer have to toil. They only had to gallop as usual, and they could charge up the fortress, brandishing their sabers as they pleased. When the so-called top fortress in the world had turned into a flat piece of land, how would Yutong's eastern troop deal with it? In this hopeless situation that was almost irreversible, Han Sanha had used this seemingly roundabout, but actually ingenious method to completely utilize the weather and geographical advantage that did not belong to Dongxian, turning it all into a helping hand for his side. Even Yutong's men were a part of the reason for the current situation. The timing, geographical advantage, and the manpower were a perfect combination of all aspects. This was also the main reason why Han Sanha had been increasing the number of troops in the country. To achieve such a strategic goal, it would be impossible if he did not have a sufficient number of troops. Zhang Ge had been by his side all this while. Right now he was even more impressed by his teacher. He was already extremely impressed by Han Sanha, to the point of prostrating himself before him. Now, he could only add the word even more to his admiration. If he were to ask himself honestly, he would never have thought of Han Sanha's idea, even if he was beaten to death. It's about 30 feet high now. Zhang Ge was excited. I believe that it'll reach the same height as the fortress wall in a few more days. No, it doesn't have to be that high. If we take into account the horse's jumping ability, we can save at least 1 or 2 days. I didn't expect our casualties to be so little under teacher's command during this attack on the Fortress of Resilience. The so-called impregnable fortress is close at hand. Han Sanha shook his head slowly. It won't be that easy, Zhang Ge said. Ah, why does teacher say so? Victory is right before our eyes. The height of the pile outside the ice fortress can only reach the bottom of the wall's original gap. There's still at least 40 feet of height from the top of the fortress. It's impossible for the pile to go any higher. I've thought of what Qiu Jianhan has thought of. How could Qiu Jianhan not have thought of what I've thought of? No, I should say that Qiu Jianhan has thought of what I've thought of since the beginning. So of course he has a countermeasure, Han Sanha said. Zhang Ge thought about it seriously and said in realization, that's right. The current situation is clear. It's impossible for them to let us keep piling up until the day when it's flat. Han Sanha said, Qiu Jianhan must have prepared a large amount of kerosene. When the time comes, the kerosene and fire arrows will take away at least tens of thousands of our elites' lives. However, if we really want to take down the Fortress of Resilience, we have to pay for these sacrifices. He thought about it and said grimly, perhaps there will be more sacrifices. By then, the casualties of the war will be the worst we've ever seen in our lives. Or perhaps it will be a terrifying number that's rarely heard of in the history of war. Yutong defended passively, doing everything it could to disrupt Dongxuan's rhythm. Dongxian continued to press forward with all of its troops, slowly accomplishing its set strategic goal. Yutong, who had lost the right time, location, and manpower, had fallen into an unprecedented disadvantage. The ice hill under the fortress wall was slowly rising. What stretched out from the top to the bottom, all the way to Han Sanha's base, was a gentle slope dozens of miles wide and long. Behind them, Dongxuan's troops had yet to stop. They began to cover the slope with sand to cover the layer of ice, so that those who could tread on this path could walk more steadily. Everywhere he looked, it was a scene that shook his soul and froze his heart. Chapter 489. Seeing the drastic change in the situation, Dongxuan's morale was unprecedentedly high. Whether it was the general or the soldiers, everyone seemed to have been injected with adrenaline, howling as they charged forward. Yutong's side, on the other hand, watched everything with gritted teeth. Many of their eyes were rimmed with tears. They could only watch helplessly as the other party moved and completed their target bit by bit, gradually taking down the city that was their natural stronghold. It made every Yutong soldier feel so aggrieved that they wanted to die. The feeling was excruciating. It was even more excruciating than having one's flesh sliced by a blunt knife. Qiu Jianhan, who had long known that the fortress of resilience would not be able to hold on, was not completely inactive. He had evacuated all the wounded soldiers and citizens in the fort. Before the wounded soldiers left, their cries were deafening. Many of them cried and begged their comrades, "Let me stay. I don't have an arm anymore, but give me a saber, and I can still drag an enemy down with me. Let me stay. I'm not leaving. Even if you kill me now and carry my body up the fort wall and pile it with stones, your father can still raise Yutong's status by half a foot." The wounded soldiers begged bitterly. However, Qiu Jianhan and Fu Baoguo were unwavering and uncompromising. There is only meaning in your lives. You are Yutong's seeds, or you can cultivate new seeds. You are nothing when you are dead. Military order, live on. No one is allowed to die, no matter what. Whoever dies will never acknowledge you as our comrade when we meet you in the underworld. Live on, because Yutong's fortress of resilience is still here. You are the fortress of resilience. The so-called indestructible fortress has never been the fortress of resilience itself, but the Yutong's eastern troop that is stationed here, the eastern soldiers. Old Marshal Qiu was teary-eyed. Live on, all of you. Brothers, you must live on. Live on to see Yutong's counterattack. Live on to help us train the new recruits. Stay alive, and watch over our beautiful lands and rivers for us. Looking at the old marshal's tears, all the wounded soldiers fell silent, no longer speaking. The wounded soldiers began to evacuate in batches. They were exceptionally swift in their retreat. They had to move quickly and leave a wide path for the army to follow. This was to prevent the disabled from blocking the path and obstructing the movement of the army. Even if I can't be loyal to the country with my brothers here, I can't be a burden to the army. We still have a mission. Even if the fortress of resilience before us falls, there's still us, another human-shaped fortress of resilience. Dongxian, damned invaders, wait for the other fortress of resilience. Time passed by slowly. On the 9th day, Dongxuan's strategic deployment was basically completed. The gentle slope below was only less than 30 feet from the top of the city wall. As long as a warrior had a decent foundation, he or she would be able to reach such a height easily. Dongxuan's army had thus gathered their experts. All of Dongxuan's martial world experts, military experts, and sect experts were gathered together. Yutong, on the other hand, was also gathering skilled cultivators. Both sides are doing the same thing. Only profound Xiuzha could deal with profound Xiuzha. In the current situation, Xiuzha, who had never been welcomed on the battlefield, was unexpectedly welcomed like never before. This was the key to this battle. It was on this night that Qiu Jianhan ordered. The 500,000 barrels of kerosene that he had collected during this period of time, as well as the ones that he had ordered before the expedition, were divided into 5 waves, and the first wave was scattered. A thick layer of kerosene flowed on the gentle slope. Much of it flowed down the slope in a sticky but unstoppable manner. The entire slope that stretched for dozens of miles was already covered in kerosene. In just a moment, the pungent smell filled the air. The kerosene on the top of the fort was still being poured down. Han Sanhe looked at the sea of kerosene, his expression uncertain. He did not give the order to attack, even after a long time had passed. He knew very well that this was Qiu Jianhan's last move. The real last move. Just like he had said, he could think of everything that Qiu Jianhan could think of, and so could the other party. Therefore, this situation had long been within their expectations. As long as Dongxuan's soldiers could charge through this inferno of kerosene, the fortress of resilience would be Dongxuan's. In spite of this, Han Sanhe still hesitated when it came to it. What he saw before him was no longer just kerosene that stretched for dozens of miles, but kerosene that covered dozens of miles. The entire area was filled with kerosene. Although Yutong had fallen into an unprecedented disadvantage, they would still need a relatively large-scale attack if they wanted to take down the fortress of resilience. Without tens of thousands of men, there was no threat at all. It was only a matter of time for him to mobilize tens of thousands of men to attack once he gave the order. However, once the tens of thousands of men charged into the kerosene before them, as long as the fire flared, these tens of thousands of men would have no chance of survival. There would be no hope of survival at all. Fire arrows. Han Sanha still gave the order. Since the sea of fire is bound to appear, let us ignite the kerosene. Han Sanha chuckled humorlessly. The concentrated fire arrows landed on the kerosene like a thunderstorm. With a loud boom, the flames that soared into the sky were ignited. In just an instant, the sea of fire had obscured everyone's vision from both sides. For a moment, the heat wave spread for dozens of miles. Everyone retreated at once, not daring to linger. Qiu Jianhan's maniacal laughter came from the top of Tiantong's wall. Han Sanha, you finally started the fire. This old man had thought that you had a heart of stone, but you still have concerns. Han Sanha's so-called decisiveness in killing is nothing more than this. Han Sanha shook his head with a bitter smile, but did not say anything. Once the fire was ignited, Dongshuan's army would not be able to charge over during the time the kerosene burned. The size of the sea of fire formed by the thick kerosene was probably even greater than a river of magma. Judging from the current scale of the kerosene, it would take at least a day and a night for it to completely burn. A day and a night would be enough to melt more than 10 feet of the frozen slope that Han Sanha had painstakingly piled up during this period of time. Although the Fortress of Resilience would be damaged in the fire as well, to the extent that it was almost destroyed, Qiu Jianhan did not care anymore. After all, the Fortress of Resilience was destined to fall. It was not important whether it was destroyed or not. Instead, Dongshuan's army would need at least 2 days to fill up the 10 feet of the frozen slope. 2 days later, this piece of land would once again be covered with kerosene. Qiu Jianhan had collected more than 500,000 barrels of kerosene in a frenzy. He had even collected the kerosene cans from the army's cooking and the people's homes. It was all for this final frenzied gamble, to delay the fall of the fortress as much as possible. Furthermore, no matter how knowledgeable Han Sanha was, he would not know how much kerosene Yutong had prepared. No matter what, before the Fortress of Resilience finally fell, Qiu Jianhan would want at least 100,000 Dongxian soldiers to be buried with him. After that, it would be time for you, Han Sanha, and the rest of us to fight to the death. Qiu Jianhan looked at the rising flames, his eyes filled with determination and cruelty. Han Sanha, if you don't pay with these 100,000 lives, how can you live up to the name of Qiu Jianhan's final battle? Fu Baogua. Yes, General. Order. Bring all the steel cavalry and the serving troop out of the fortress at once and retreat to the West Mountain, Qiu Jianhan said. Other than Tianxian Cliff, all the peaks and ridges in the West Mountain have been demolished by me these days. That place is the final narrow area leading to the nation's border. By then, your steel cavalry and the serving troop will form another line of defense there. It will be Yutong's second Fortress of Resilience. I'd rather fight to the last man than let Han Sanha pass so easily. Fu Baogua's tears streamed down his cheeks. Old Marshal, this lowly general thinks that it's better for Old Marshal to do this. This lowly general doesn't have complete control over the steel cavalry. Only Old Marshal can take charge of the situation. The plan here has been set. Let this general stay. F***ck off. Qiu Jianhan was furious. Scram. I'm not leaving. I can't be the one who should leave. Fu Baogua was defiant, which was rare for him. His face was resolute. This general has already sworn to heaven that this body will live and die with the Fortress of Resilience. Old Marshal is forcing me to go against my oath by asking me to leave. F***ck your ancestors. F***ck your oath. What nonsense are you talking about? This is a battlefield, a military camp. Even if God is here, he can only listen to your father's military orders. Those who disobey military orders will be beheaded immediately. Qiu Jianhan was unreasonable. Your father, scram immediately. Your father isn't letting you live. I'm letting you die in battle somewhere else. Didn't you hear that it's also the Fortress of Resilience? How is this going against your **t oath? Scram, scram, scram. What are you waiting for? Your father will kill you. Chapter 490. Marshal, the thickness of the ice has dropped more than expected. Besides, Yutong has poured kerosene again. How much is it this time? I still don't see any decrease in the amount. Fire arrows, burn it. Han Sanha gave his order. A few days later. Marshal, Yutong is pouring kerosene again. Should we? Can you tell how much is it exactly? I can't tell. At least, I don't see any signs of it decreasing compared to the previous times. Fire arrows, burn it. Han Sanha frowned deeply. Qiu Jianhan, how much kerosene have you King collected? Why can't you burn it all? It's been burned 4 times already. Each time. It's a huge amount of kerosene that's genuine. Why is there still so much? Watching the billowing smoke from afar, Han Sanha's frown deepened, as if he could vaguely sense that something was amiss. Zhang Ge, who was following beside Han Sanha, was frowning as well, deep in thought. The slope that he had built should have been a textbook stroke of genius, but today, it had been completely sealed by Qiu Jianhan's kerosene. Although there were no major casualties among the troops, it was not a good idea to continue this stalemate. Speed was the most important factor in military affairs. Any delay would lead to changes. Who knew what would happen if this stalemate continued for so many days? The best-case scenario was that Yutong's kerosene would run out. But the current situation was that the kerosene seemed to be endless and could not be depleted no matter how hard they tried. At least we didn't get smothered today, Zhang Ge said with lingering fear as he wiped his face. The few times the kerosene had retaliated, thick smoke billowing and engulfing Dongshuan's base. Han Sanha and Zhang Ge, who had been observing the situation from the front lines with Han Sanha, were utterly disheveled by the smoke. Han Sanha was stunned when he heard that and frowned. You didn't get smothered today? He looked at the opposite side with a frown and suddenly ordered. Send a few people with a higher cultivation base to take a closer look at the kerosene later. As soon as the order was given, several Peak Realm cultivators rushed over against the monstrous flames. Reporting to Marshal, the kerosene that Yutong has splashed this time isn't pure kerosene. It's mixed with a lot of water. Although it can still burn, the actual fire is much weaker than the previous few times. Hearing the report, a faint smile hung on Han Sanha's face, as if he had expected it. Zhang Ge perked up as well. Teacher, looks like Qiu Jianhan doesn't have much kerosene left. Han Sanha said faintly. Even if it's not much, it can still burn and still be lethal. Still ignore him. Continue to wait. Another 2 days later, the Fortress of Resilience was calm. There was no oil pouring down like before. On Han Sanha's side, the generals were whispering to each other, barely concealing their excitement. Marshal, let's attack. Yutong is no longer pouring oil down. It's always the same amount of kerosene every time. No matter how prepared they are. It should have been used up by now. Now it must have been used up. Yes. Now is the best time for us to seize the opportunity and attack. Instead, it was Han Sanha who thought about it for a moment before he said, we will attack from 3 sides at the same time this time. Each side. He thought about it carefully and said, 10,000 men. The generals looked at each other in bewilderment at the number. 10,000 men on each side meant that there was only a total of 30,000 men. How could they take down the Fortress of Resilience with such a military force and lineup? In spite of this, no one dared refute Han Sanha's decision. The attack from 3 sides was instantaneous, charging forward like a swarm of bees. Seeing that Dongshuan's soldiers had charged all the way up the slope and were about to reach the top of the fort, Yutong's side finally made their move, releasing arrows in unison. Bucket after bucket of kerosene poured down like a river bursting its banks. The flaming arrows rained down like rain, meeting the pouring kerosene. The front of the Fortress of Resilience turned into a sea of fire at once, the flames billowing into the sky. In spite of this, Han Sanha's gaze was calm as he watched the rising flames from afar. He smiled faintly and said, I've been too careful in this attack. It looks like that old man Qiu Jianhan really doesn't have much kerosene left. Han Sanha's words had a basis to them. The fire in front of the Fortress of Resilience was only burning fiercely at the beginning, but it only lasted for a moment before it gradually calmed down. Some of the places that were still burning were actually slowly extinguishing. What truly posed a threat to Dongxuan's soldiers was the sudden appearance of Yutong's soldiers. Their swords and sabers gleamed as they slaughtered their enemies. Now it was Yutong and Dongxuan's long-awaited close-quarters combat, a head-on battle. As Dongxuan's troops charged in like a madman, a large number of Yutong's soldiers retaliated as well. The battle was unusually intense, but Dongxuan's army was only 30,000 men. Even when both sides were evenly matched, Yutong's side still had the home field advantage. Qiu Jianhan, whose white beard fluttered in the wind, stood at the top of the fort, directing the battle with his sword, tilting the battle in Yutong's favor. Sound the gong. Han Sanha ordered with a wave of his hand. There was no need to continue the battle. The 30,000 soldiers attacking this time was to test if the enemy still had a large amount of kerosene. Now that it had been proven, there was no need to continue the battle. Tomorrow morning, we shall start cooking at 3 in the morning. We shall attack the fort at 5 in the morning. 120,000 men, attack only 2 sides. Han Sanha ordered calmly. Conquer the fortress of resilience in this battle and settle the situation. Yes, the generals understood the 30,000 men's intention to attack the fort today as well. Their morale was high, their voices roaring when they received the order. Teacher, Zhang Ge was still puzzled. Why are you still surprised when everyone knows about it? Once I'm around, does your battlefield vanish into thin air? This is a bad habit. Han Sanha was obviously in a good mood as he explained with a smile. According to Yutong's reserves all these years, there must be a lot of kerosene that's necessary to defend the fort. Therefore, I've been depleting their kerosene these days. Even when the battle dragged on, I still didn't dare launch an all-out attack. After all, once we face the sea of fire made of kerosene, we'll suffer heavy casualties. In these days, Yutong has poured kerosene 6 times. The first time was the most. When it came to the 4th time, it was already mixed with water. The 5th time, the proportion of water was even higher. As for today's round, the proportion of water mixed in was already rather high. It's not even enough to cause enough damage. If it wasn't for Yutong's troops appearing at the top of the fort in time to launch a counterattack, and that old man Qiu Jianhan's appearance to supervise the battle today, the 30,000 men might really have broken through the fort. All of this means that their reserve of kerosene has basically been depleted. Even if there's still some left, it's only a few. It doesn't affect the overall situation. Han Sanha said, therefore, tomorrow is the time to launch an all-out attack. The entire army will press forward and take down the fortress of resilience in one fell swoop, clearing the path to Yutong once and for all. Zhang Ge asked, Teacher, could this be another tactic of Qiu Jianhan's to conceal the truth? Han Sanha said faintly, Of course there's such a possibility. I've never dared underestimate the old man, Qiu Jianhan. However, according to the storage of kerosene, Qiu Jianhan has already used at least 400,000 barrels of the actual kerosene that has been consumed these days. During this period of time, the number reported by more than 30 observation posts is 3 times higher than this number. I believe that the higher ones are all water. However, if we were to use this as the starting point, even if Yutong were to collect kerosene with all its might, the amount that could reach the fortress of resilience during this period of time would only be this much. That's 2 million barrels of kerosene. That's a joke. Even the entire Tianxian continent might not be able to gather so much. Chapter 491. Zhang Ji's heart skipped a beat. He could vaguely feel that perhaps his thoughts were true. His teacher might not be oblivious to it, but he still had to carry out his previous plan to the end. Early the next morning, the sky had yet to brighten. Dawn always came exceptionally late in winter. However, the deafening battle cries almost shattered the dark night. Dongxuan's main attack had finally begun. Within the fortress of resilience, Yutong's army, who had long been exhausted, rushed to the top of the fort at once. Right now, Qiu Jianhan was already skinny beyond recognition. This old marshal, who was already past his 70s, had been staying at the top of the fort all this time, standing amidst the thick smoke. There were a few times when he had fainted from the smoke. After all, The top of the fort was where the flames were the hottest. Even with a profound mystical skill to protect himself, it was still difficult for him to withstand the heat. However, he would rather be overwhelmed than take a step away from the top of the fort. How many of the enemy troops are participating in the main attack? Qiu Jianhan's voice was extremely hoarse. His eyes glowed like the wisps in the darkness. More than 100,000. Wang Dinghua had only roughly listened to the movements on the other end before he reported an accurate number. This was the military training of a veteran general. It was nothing. It's still too little. Qiu Jianhan sighed. However, this should be Han Sanhe's limit. This is the last harvest we can reap. Wang Dinghua stood straight. They will not be able to return alive. Use the rest of the kerosene for this battle. There's no need to keep any reserve. Pour it all down. Qiu Jianhan coughed violently and spat out a mouthful of phlegm tinged with blood. He said sternly, "After pouring all the kerosene down, evacuate the fort quickly. According to the plan, head to the west gate for the final battle." Yes, buckets of kerosene were poured down in an orderly manner. There were also teams of Yutang soldiers who charged down from the top of the fort amidst loud roars, charging into the sea of kerosene with their own bodies to engage the enemy in hand-to-hand combat. With the ice as a buffer, Yutang's soldiers had an advantage as well. At least for now, they could leap down the fort without fear of injury. A total of 30,000 Yutang warriors charged out like frenzied tigers, fighting the enemy to the death amidst the flowing kerosene. The mentality of these Yutang warriors was different from Dongshuan's soldiers. Dongshuan's soldiers only knew that the enemy had gone mad, and that this was the last fight to the death. As long as they could defeat them, it would be victory. It would be a smooth path forward, and there would be no hindrance. Yutang's soldiers, on the other hand, knew very well that from the moment they had charged down, their lives were already on the countdown. Once the kerosene under their feet was completely poured, they would ignite into a raging inferno. At that time, be it himself or the enemy, they would all turn into a pile of charcoal. At this moment, no matter if he won or lost, he would definitely die. But they were still fearless. Follow me to hell. Dongxian brats. Ha ha ha. Ever since the 30,000 Yutang warriors had leaped down from the top of the city wall, they had formed an unprecedentedly powerful troop. Wielding their sabers and spears, they launched the strongest and most extreme counterattack, suppressing Dongshuan's 100,000 men and making it difficult for them to advance any further. "Marshal, Yutang's troop has jumped down from the Fortress of Resilience to fight." How many of them have come? They are coming aggressively. The attack that my 100,000 men have been preparing has been stopped. Does this mean that the enemy has at least 50,000 men? Yes, there are even more. Han Sanhe paced around in silence and finally ordered, "Increase the troop by 80,000. Victory is imminent." In Dongshuan's formation, the beating of the war drums changed abruptly, resounding in a different manner. Under the illumination of the torch, Han Sanhe's expression was uncertain. Qiu Jianhan has always loved his soldiers like his own children. If it wasn't the last moment, such an extreme tactic would never appear. That means, the bodies of Yutang's 30,000 warriors had turned into a new fortress of resilience on the slope that had been forged by both the enemy and their own. They charged forward in a frenzy, disregarding their own lives. At this moment, everything was no longer in their minds. Their parents, wives, children, lovers, brothers, friends, everything in the past, all flashed through their minds before they were tossed to the back of their minds. They had turned into a ferocious tiger that had descended the mountain with bloodshot eyes. A majestic voice resounded abruptly. Someone sprung up and hollered in midair. "Yutang's warriors are here. Who dares invade our land? Who dares invade our land?" All 30,000 warriors bellowed in unison and took 3 steps forward. "We have no regrets in this life to enter Yutang," the fierce voice hollered. "We have no regrets in this life to enter Yutang," the 30,000 warriors hollered. "We forged the fortress with our iron bones," the fierce voice hollered. "We forged the fortress with our iron bones." The fierce voice took another 3 steps forward. "If there is a next life, let us fight. If there is a next life, let us fight." Sacrifice our bodies and bones to repay the country's kindness. Sacrifice our bodies and bones to repay the country's kindness. All 30,000 warriors howled into the sky like wolves. They charged forward without a care for their own safety, and plunged into Dongxuan's formation. As they hollered, they fought with their lives on the line. Today, we face the national calamity. Why should we pity this body? If there is a next life. We are still Yutong's men. Saber light glinted as blood gushed into the sky. Countless warriors charged into the enemy's formation in the darkness before dawn. They killed the enemy and fell. The cycle repeated endlessly, as if they would not stop until they were dead. It was because of these people's sacrifice that the blood and corpses of countless Dongxian soldiers flowed into a small river on the ground. Yutong's soldiers at the top of the fort were still teary-eyed, but they were resolute as they poured the kerosene in buckets. Every Yutong soldier on the fort felt their blood burning intensely. They wanted very much to fight with their lives like the 30,000 warriors, but they could not. They still had the responsibility of pouring kerosene. Only when this last responsibility was completed could they talk about other things. On Dongxuan's side, the war drums were still beating loudly. Countless warriors charged up like the rising tide. At this point in the battle, only a few of the 30,000 warriors who had charged down the fort were left. Even the survivors were covered in wounds, but they were still fighting without retreating. A man who was drenched in blood roared into the sky. Who can take a step forward before our grandfathers are all dead? Ha ha ha. The warriors who were trapped in the enemy's formation guffawed in unison. That's right. Who can take a step forward before our grandfathers are all dead? Old Marshal, the accumulated kerosene has been poured. Wang Dinggua's tears flowed freely. Qiu Jianhan's expression was solemn. Wait a little longer. Wait until our warriors have all died in the battle. They shouldn't die in the sea of fire cast by our own people. This old man wants all of them to die on the battlefield. They must never die in the hands of our own people. Yes. Wang Dinggua and Qiu Jianhan stood at the highest point, watching the battle below closely. What they saw made them tremble, choking with sobs. The heroic cries from below grew fainter and fainter, until they could no longer be heard. There were already Dongxian soldiers popping out from the top of the fort. Qiu Jianhan's eyes were ablaze. Suddenly, he roared with all his might. Light the fire! Send our brothers off! Light the fire! Wang Dinggua sprung up like a madman. The longbow in his hand pulled back into a full moon. The moment the fire arrow was ignited, it shot out swiftly. Light the fire! Countless Yutong soldiers were crying out loud with tears streaming down their faces. At the same time, countless fire arrows lit up the sky above the fortress of resilience. Send our brothers off! Boom! The fire that soared into the sky was ignited, the heat waves billowing. On the ground, the sticky kerosene that had been flowing everywhere lit up abruptly like wriggling fire dragons and soared into the sky, burning fiercely like never before. The front line of Dongxuan's hundreds of thousands of soldiers had already charged up to the top of Yutong's fort, but the ones at the back, or rather, most of the soldiers, were still on the slope, advancing swiftly. The moment the fire suddenly ignited, it spread at an unimaginable and unbelievable speed, instantly burning to the other end of the gentle slope. This also meant that the hundreds of thousands of Dongxuan soldiers, who had launched the attack, were trapped in the sea of fire at the same time. Chapter 492. The sudden raging fire separated the armies of the two countries. At the same time, a deafening roar erupted from the top of the fortress of resilience. It was a roar of joy. It was a roar of farewell to their comrades. Brothers, do you see this? All of you did not die in vain. These hundreds of thousands of Dongxian soldiers are all buried with you. They are all sacrifices that our brothers have sent to you. We shall not go to the underworld alone. We shall walk together with the enemy. Wang Dinggua howled into the sky, hot tears rolling down his cheeks. Qiu Jianhan's lips trembled as tears streamed down his cheeks. Why should I hesitate to sacrifice my body to face the national crisis today? I am a man of Yutong in life, and a soul of Yutong in death. If there's a next life, I shall be a brave warrior again, strengthen Yutong's heart, and be Yutong's army again. Brothers, all of you are great. I, Qiu Jianhan, have no regrets in dying without regrets to be able to fight with all of you in this lifetime. To be able to die with all of you is even more honorable, an honor indeed. I hope that all of you will wait for me. When this old man deals a heavy blow to Han Sanha at the west gate, I shall reunite with all of you. The road to the underworld is long. There are many enemies accompanying us. How can we lack a leader? Millions of loyal souls should still be here. The army of the underworld is still in formation, only waiting for this old man to sound the war drums and slaughter all of Dongshuan's souls. Qiu Jianhan hollered, "Retreat! Retreat at full speed!" Wang Dinggua let out a long howl. Countless Yutong soldiers retreated from the top of the fort like a receding tide. Qiu Jianhan mounted his horse and did not look back. Leave the fort. Behind him, the fire burned thousands of feet into the sky. The entire top of the Fortress of Resilience was already in shambles. The outermost part of the outer wall had already been burnt to a crisp. The Fortress of Resilience that had been renowned throughout the world for decades, known as an impregnable fortress, could no longer live up to its name and no longer existed. Amidst the fire, the struggles of the hundreds of thousands of Dongxian soldiers grew weaker until only the crackling sound of burning could be heard. A fire that had been set up for many days, had actually cost the lives of hundreds of thousands of Dongxian soldiers. On the other side, Yutong's soldiers retreated from the top of the wall at a frightening speed, one after the other, like specters. In an extremely short time, the Fortress of Resilience was empty. It was like an empty city. Qiu Jianhan led the last 50,000 men out of the city in a single file. There were so many of them, but they did not make any noise at all. Even the fluttering flags were neat and tidy, without the slightest bit of disorder. Many soldiers carried a military flag, their heads held high and their chests puffed out. However, there was no one else beside him. There should have been a few hundred or even a few thousand people under the flag, but now there was only one person left. He carried the tattered flag with his head held high and chest puffed out. It was as if his brothers had never left. They were still in the formation, accompanying him as he marched silently. He was still here, the flag was still here. How could the brothers who stood under this flag not be here? This kind of military flag could be seen everywhere among the troops leaving the city. A soldier, holding the military flag high, was clearly bleeding from his chest, and his injuries were severe. In spite of this, he continued to march forward with his head held high, his chest puffed out, as if he did not feel anything. The brothers beside him wanted to help out of goodwill, but they were glared at by the soldier. "My brother, I am the only one who can carry our banner. Only I can carry it. It means that there are still people in our formation. We don't need help." The sound of footsteps and hooves rang in the empty Fortress of Resilience, eliciting echoes. It was as if there were millions of Yutong's loyal souls marching out of the fortress in a neat formation, waiting for the moment of a battle to the death. Looking at the fire that had suddenly erupted in front of him, Han Sanha's face flushed as a gush of blood rushed to his head, causing him to feel dizzy. Spat. Han Sanha spat out a mouthful of blood, his eyes glaring as he said, "Qiu Jianhan, how vicious you are." No one, including Han Sanha, had expected that the 30,000 Yutong warriors who had charged down the fort and launched a counterattack at the last moment was actually Qiu Jianhan's plan to lure the enemy, to seize the opportunity to attack. He had used tens of thousands of Yutong's loyal souls as bait, as an opportunity to allow Dongshuan's troops to attack without worry. But in the end, he had lost 180,000 Dongxian elites. Even Han Sanha could not have expected such a move. Like Zhang Ge, Han Sanha had also considered that Qiu Jianhan might have hidden a certain amount of kerosene in case of an emergency. But he had never expected that Qiu Jianhan, who was known to love his soldiers like his own children, would actually go to such extremes and break convention. Zhang Ge, who was watching from the side, felt a chill run down his spine as he watched the tragic scene. If he were in Qiu Jianhan's shoes, he would never have used such a desperate tactic. Tens of thousands of his men were still fighting with their lives on the line, while the rear was pouring kerosene endlessly. With a big fire, The enemy and his comrades were all turned into ashes. The plan was ruthless and merciless. Just like what Han Sanha had said, it was truly vicious. This is the most resolute Qiu Jianhan has ever been since he became a marshal. Han Sanha spat out a mouthful of blood, his face pale and defeated, but his agitated emotions had already calmed down. He said softly as he wiped away the blood at the corner of his mouth with his sleeve. Right now, there was only solemn respect in his eyes. There was no resentment at all. I've always thought that Qiu Jianhan is inferior to me when it comes to military strategy. The reason is because he's less ruthless than I am. Less ruthless and merciless. I never thought that it would be Qiu Jianhan, who taught me a lesson at the last moment. This old man is ashamed. Han Sanha closed his eyes softly. It's not that Qiu Jianhan isn't ruthless. It's not that he can't be hateful. It's just that no one has ever been able to force him to this extent. Call a truce for now, retreat. Han Sanha ordered. When the fire dies down, the fortress of resilience will be ours. Since Qiu Jianhan has made such an arrangement, it means that he no longer cares about the fortress of resilience. We, on the other hand, have to prepare for Qiu Jianhan's duel of life and death the moment we exit the fortress of resilience. Yun Yang was burning with anxiety. He was less than 300 miles away from the fortress of resilience now. It was difficult for him to advance any further. The current time limit was already a few days past the time he had agreed on with the village youths. In fact, he had been trapped here for a few days already. In front of the mountain, there were thousands of corpses strewn all over the place. There were more than 100 superb cultivators lying in ambush on the mountain, each of them an expert among experts. Anyone who passed by would be intercepted and killed. Whether they were martial artists who had rushed to the front line, civilians who had joined the army, or passers-by, they were not spared. It was better to kill 1,000 innocents than to let a single person off. Yun Yang had tried to take a detour from another direction several times, but he was intercepted without exception. His injuries had healed now. Other than feeling slightly weak, he was fine. However, even with his Heaven Realm cultivation base, he could not make it through. He had even been injured a few times, and was almost killed in the forest. Whether it was a detour or a head-on charge, none of them worked. The enemies lying in ambush were like a nail wedged here. Yun Yang had long recognized who the enemies in front of him were. They were led by the Four Seasons Tower's four venerable lords. Other than the four venerable lords, there were other experts as well, all of them top-notch experts of the Four Seasons Tower. They seemed to have sensed something, and had set up a death trap in the midst of the mountains. They could not be sure which one was Supreme Cloud. So what they had done was to prevent anyone from passing through. Even a bird would not be able to fly over. It was these people who had intercepted Yun Yang here. He knew that time was running out, and that the Fortress of Resilience could not hold out much longer. But he had been stopped right here. Yun Yang was almost on fire. If he were to turn around and advance from another path, he would have to go around dozens of mountains and take a detour to the north, then charge through from the north. However, if he did so, he would need at least half a month's time, even if he had the fastest horse in the world. If he were to drag this on for another half a month, everything would be over by then. Yun Yang had been disguising himself in an attempt to break through, but he could not do so no matter what. It was as if the target of the interception was not a specific target, but, as long as you passed through here, you would not be able to pass. A radius of hundreds of miles was shrouded in deific consciousness. In the truest sense, the living were not allowed to enter. Those who trespass would die. Who knew how many experts the Four Seasons Tower had sent out this time to create such a crazy effect? What surprised Yun Yang the most was that there were a few spiritual restraining formations set up in the surrounding mountains. The targets were clearly set up to deal with the 9 Supremes. Chapter 493. Yun Yang did not want to expose his identity. After discovering the spiritual restraining formation, he left his horse aside and attempted to break through the barrier alone. However, despite repeated attempts, he could not break through. In spite of this, the Four Seasons Tower's men were shocked. They did not know where this bloodstained fellow had come from. His movements were strange and unpredictable. A slight misstep would cause them to suffer. It was fortunate that this fellow's cultivation base was slightly weaker. Otherwise, they would not have been able to stop him. Out of options, Yin Yang made up his mind and retreated dozens of miles back. He turned into a righteous one and resumed his disguise as the capital city's young master Yin. Yin Yang, the young Marquis of Heavenly Clouds, rushing to the Fortress of Resilience as reinforcements. He had planned to keep his identity a secret, because Yin Yang was worried that his identity would be restored when he went over. However, if he went over and his 9 Supreme's abilities were suddenly restored when the situation was critical, Supreme Cloud's sudden arrival at the Fortress of Resilience would be an unexpected visit. However, the number of experts who had gone over during this period of time was very limited. With a little thought, he could confirm that this young Master Yin Yang was Supreme Cloud. Then, he would have no secrets to speak of with the Four Seasons Tower. However, Yin Yang was anxious after failing to cross the barrier multiple times, so he did not care anymore. He would think about the future when it came. He might not be able to restore the 9 Supreme's abilities immediately. No matter what, he had to cross the barrier first. Yin Yang, who had reverted to his previous appearance, was dressed in purple, his hair tied up with a purple jade crown. His face was as bright as the moon, his eyes long and brows long, his hair fluttering in the wind. A long saber hung from his waist, and a magnificent crimson horse galloped along the way. Young Master Yin was like a jade, and his horse was like a dragon. Reddy galloped all the way, jumping 100 feet in a single leap. Dozens of miles were covered in a snap of a finger. In the blink of an eye, the man and the horse had arrived before the mountain. Yin Yang seemed to be completely unaware of the strong obstacle blocking the way as he continued to gallop forward, his speed increasing instead of slowing down. It was as if the situation was urgent and urgent. At this moment, a sword light shone from the dense forest, falling like a cloud of mist, filled with a chilling murderous intent. Yin Yang seemed to be shocked, but he did not panic. As he counterattacked with his saber, he sprung up and hollered, "Who is it?" As soon as he made his move, Merciless Blade had already been unleashed as he launched a fierce counterattack. It was unknown whether the attacker had seen Yin Yang's appearance, or he had some impression of Merciless Blade's unique skill. But he exclaimed in surprise, "Yin Yang!" It was obvious that the other party was surprised to see Yin Yang. Yin Yang was even more surprised. Venerable Lord Frost. Suddenly, someone appeared from the forest. He was dressed in a long robe of frost and snow. His gaze was like cold lightning. It was Venerable Lord Frost, one of the 4 remaining Venerable Lords of the Four Seasons Tower. He was looking at Yin Yang in surprise as well. Yin Yang's strike had missed. He had lost his momentum due to the misuse of his strength, causing him to fall from the sky. He yelled angrily, "Venerable Lord Frost, why is the Four Seasons Tower so persistent? Are all your words mere farts?" Venerable Lord Frost said angrily, "Why are we haunting you? Who are you saying is just farting? Watch your mouth." Yin Yang was even more enraged. "If you're not haunting me, why are you blocking my way? If your words aren't mere farts, why are you trying to kill me? The promise from that day is still fresh in my ears. You're the one who attacked first, and now you're complaining that my mouth isn't clean?" Venerable Lord Frost froze and only spoke after a while. "How would I know it was you? What? You didn't know it was me? You attacked without seeing the target clearly? Who are you trying to fool?" Yin Yang said, "Forget it. I'm busy now. I don't have time to bicker with you. I'm only asking you, do you know it's me now? Why aren't you moving? Do you really want your words to be like a fart?" Venerable Lord Frost said, "Not even if it's you. I can't let you pass now." Yin Yang said angrily, "Puffed. Are you going to go back on your words now? Did the 4 venerables really mean what they said? Tell me, what do you want to do to me? You're strong after all. No matter what you want to do, I can only accept it." Venerable Lord Frost looked embarrassed as he mumbled to defend himself. "I didn't say I want to do anything to you. I just can't let you pass. This has to be done. It's not that we intentionally broke the promise. That's all." Yin Yang snorted coldly, looking like he was suppressing his anger as he said in a low voice, "Venerable Lord Frost, we've met once, haven't we? I've saved Venerable Lord Sword's life that day in exchange for the promise between us. It's not just a one-sided promise from the Four Seasons Tower. You've broken the promise and blocked my way. Shouldn't you at least explain to me what's going on?" Venerable Lord Frost said coldly, "I'm merely following orders to seal off this road. Anyone who's alive on this road heading towards the northeast is to be intercepted. There are no exceptions. Trespassers shall die. The fact that you're still alive is already due to the fate of that fateful day. Be content with what you have." Yin Yang sighed helplessly and said, All right. The Four Seasons Tower has always been domineering, sealing the road as you wish. Blocking my way is still giving me face. Can't I be content with what I have? However, I still want to ask you something. Does Venerable Lord Frost still remember the conditions that the Four Seasons Tower has promised me? Does it still count? Venerable Lord Frost answered, Of course it does. Otherwise you'd be a dead man by now. Yin Yang said angrily, It's good that it counts. I remember one of the conditions saying that we'll all mind our own business from now on. The Four Seasons Tower in particular is not to look for trouble with me on your own accord. Is that not what it says? Venerable Lord Frost chuckled and said, There is indeed such a condition, but it's not the Four Seasons Tower who's looking for trouble with you. It's you who's looking for trouble with us. Yin Yang hollered, Nonsense. You can't stop farting, can you? I'm going to assist the Eastern Front, and I have the Imperial Edict with me. There's no time to lose. It's obvious that you're trying to sabotage our country's grand plan by blocking my way here. How dare you say that I'm the one who's looking for trouble? How preposterous. Do you really feel guilty about making irresponsible remarks like this? Venerable Lord Frost knew that he was in the wrong and said faintly, No matter what you say, I can't let you pass. Not killing you is already my limit. Yin Yang said as if he was about to vomit blood. All right, I know who you're waiting for here. I also know what you're trying to do here. But what does this have to do with me? What's the use of you stopping me? I think you're looking for trouble with me on purpose, aren't you? Venerable Lord Frost snorted. You know who we're waiting for? Yin Yang said angrily. You're still being stubborn? Who in this world doesn't know that your sole purpose of waiting here is to stop Supreme Wind? Do I have to spell it out when it's so obvious? Don't tell me you think that there's something fishy and mysterious about this matter? Venerable Lord Frost snorted and did not speak anymore. It was obvious that he had realized that this matter was not worth debating. It was the truth. But those who had met him previously had been killed along the way. There was no room to think about anything else. Let's say that if it was someone you don't know, you could have stopped him and killed him. It's not that your luck is too bad. But who am I? I'm Yin Yang, the young Marquis of Heavenly Clouds. Am I Supreme Wind? I have no intention of spoiling your plans. Nor have I provoked you. Especially when we've had many dealings. But you still want to do this? Isn't that too unfair? Let's put it this way. I'll only ask you one thing. Am I Lord Supreme Wind? Am I the target of your ambush? Yin Yang's face was earnest and sincere. Nonsense. Venerable Lord Frost rolled his eyes and said angrily, Your words are as good as fart. Yin Yang spat blood and said, Answer my question. Am I Supreme Wind? Say it. Venerable Lord Frost looked impatient. Of course you're not Supreme Wind. Otherwise, how could you be allowed to live until now? This old man would have killed you long ago. After yesterday's update, the whole family had New Year's dinner. I drank with the old man and in the end, I was actually made drunk by the old man. Chapter 494. Yin Yang spread his arms and said as if he was about to vomit blood. That's right. You're sure that I'm not Lord Supreme Wind, aren't you? Indeed. Since you're sure, why don't you make way for me to pass? Yin Yang looked like he was about to cry again. We're all old acquaintances. Can we stop fooling around? Venerable Lord Frost scratched his head and thought for a moment, thinking that what Yin Yang said made sense. We're waiting for Supreme Wind. To ensure our safety, we have to annihilate everyone who passes by here. We'd rather kill them than let them go unpunished because they could all be Supreme Wind. However, there was someone whom Venerable Lord Frost knew very well. Someone who was not Supreme Wind. Was it really necessary to stop him from passing? However, the order they had received was, no matter who it was, even if it was a dog or an ant, as long as it was a living thing, they were not allowed to pass through. If there was an intruder, no matter who it was, they were to kill without mercy. Even if Yin Yang was definitely not Supreme Wind, and was someone they knew, he was still within the ban. So should he let them go or not? Venerable Lord Frost could not make up his mind, hesitating and hesitating. Military intelligence is like a raging fire. Yin Yang said anxiously, Venerable Lord Frost, can you please be merciful? At most, I'll treat you to a drink when you guys come to Tiantang City again. Venerable Lord Frost rolled his eyes and said subconsciously, who cares about your wine? How can you say that? Yin Yang was furious. Why don't you say that? How can you stop me? You know that I'm not your target, yet you're still arguing here. You, will you only let me go if I'm so angry that I'm going to vomit blood? You guys have agreed to this condition. How can the Four Seasons Tower be so shameless? Is this the bearing of the Four Seasons Tower that rules the world? Yin Yang looked like he was about to die from grief and indignation. He was probably thinking about what Venerable Lord Frost would do to him. Venerable Lord Frost hesitated again and finally said, forget it. Wait for a while. I'll find Sword to talk to you. He'll speak first. There's no need to search. We're all here. The voice was like a long sword being unsheathed. It was Venerable Lord Sword. Supreme Sword looked much thinner than when they had last met in Tiantang City. At the same time, he looked much more somber as well. The man's gaze towards Yin Yang was exceptionally unfriendly. Of course, there was a reason for this man's attitude towards Yin Yang. He had been inflicted with Yin Yang's blood coagulation poison, which had caused his body to be crippled to a certain extent. Any man would not be friendly towards anyone related to this matter. Beside Venerable Lord Sword, there were Venerable Lord Snow, Venerable Lord Ice, and another 5 to 6 people whom Yin Yang did not know. All of them had hidden their abilities well, and their cultivation base was incredibly high. There was no doubt that they were the Four Seasons Tower's top experts. Venerable Lord Sword is here too? Nice to meet you. Yin Yang said angrily. The Four Seasons Tower is so heartless and goes back on your words. How can you stand in the martial world? Venerable Lord Frost is one thing. But you, Venerable Lord Sword, have been saved by me before. The past is still vivid in my mind, but now you're going back on your words. How infuriating. Venerable Lord Sword was so furious that his lungs were about to explode when he uttered those words. What do you mean by saving my life? If it wasn't for your mischief and poison the other time, how could I have been injured? How could I be crippled? How could I not be able to lift my head up until now? Nonsense. Venerable Lord Sword snorted coldly. Yin Yang, this isn't Tiantang City. We've promised not to make things difficult for you in Tiantang City. But here, we're not restricted. Yin Yang smirked. Impressive, impressive. He was indeed a shameless person. How dare you play word games with me? Venerable Lord Sword, you really shouldn't be hanging around in the martial world. You should be an official in the imperial court. Who knows if what you're saying is real, or just bullsh**. To think that such shameless words could come out of Venerable Lord Sword's mouth in such a dignified manner. I'm utterly impressed. It's truly an eye-opener for me. I'm utterly impressed to the point of prostrating myself before you. Venerable Lord Sword said coldly. Yin Yang, your words are so filthy. Do you really think that my sword can't kill? You're the one who provoked me first. You're the one who's provoked me first. Yin Yang mocked. Whether your sword can kill or not has nothing to do with me. I'll only ask the four of you one thing now, one thing. Today, are you going to make way for us or not? Speak quickly. Venerable Lord Ice spoke for the first time. So what if we make way? So what if we don't? Yin Yang snorted and said, what do you mean, what do you mean? If you make way, I'll go and do what I want to do. Do you think I can still build a house and live here? On the other hand, if you don't make way, this young master won't waste any more words. I'll turn around and take a detour. It's just a matter of time. It's not a big deal. Venerable Lord Ice said coldly. There's still a next, isn't there? Yin Yang gritted his teeth and said, Of course there's a next. You've all given me a peach. Of course I have to return the favor. I, Yin Yang, am an insignificant character. Of course, I have to help you spread the word about how the Four Seasons Tower is true to its word, and how it keeps its promise. How you can't even acknowledge what you've promised them. It's truly worthy of the world's top sect. It's truly Mr. Nyen's sect. It's only to spread your names. It's the hardest business of mine. I'll help you all spread your names from morning till night. You'll be known by the world overnight. I'm still very confident. These are the facts that I've experienced personally. Isn't it convincing enough? Venerable Lord Ice hollered coldly. What a sharp-tongued child. Yin Yang was unfazed. You venerable lords can't even abide by the heavens vow you've made. What does it matter if I say a few more words? Right, my words carry little weight. Even if what I say is the truth, not many will believe it. How about I ask His Majesty the Emperor to issue a royal edict to help you spread the word after I return? That should be credible enough, right? The people beside him were experts of the Four Seasons Tower as well. Upon hearing his words, they asked in confusion, What have you all promised? Do you have to be bullied by a child like this? The muscles on Venerable Lord Frost's face twitched as he recounted what had happened earlier in a low voice. The rest of them shut their mouths at once. In the martial world, words were spoken like the wind. Keeping one's word was the most basic creed. Not to mention that it was the heavens' vow they had made that day. However, if they were to let him pass, how would they explain it to their lord? The situation was at a stalemate. Yin Yang, who had waited quietly for a moment, suddenly snorted and turned to leave. Forget it. Continue blocking the way, I'll take a detour. A shameless man is indeed invincible. I've witnessed the Four Seasons Tower's glory today, to the very end. What a trustworthy man. Wait, Venerable Lord Sword hollered coldly. It's not impossible if you want to pass. However, there's a condition that must be made clear. Yin Yang turned around. What condition? Speak quickly, speak quickly. This young master is busy. I have no time to waste with you. Venerable Lord Sword stepped forward with his sword in hand. The martial world's affair shall be decided by our fists. As long as you can defeat the sword in my hand, I'll let you pass. Isn't this a fair condition? Yin Yang guffawed when he heard what Venerable Lord Sword had to say. It was only after a while that his laughter gradually subsided. Venerable Lord Sword, your challenge is really not classy enough. Why don't you call that Mr. Nyen out as well and gather all the experts of the Four Seasons Tower? I'll fight all of you alone. If I win, I'll pass. Isn't that even better? The Four Seasons Tower's experts were flushed, speechless for a moment. Venerable Lord Sword, senior expert, can you still be so shameless? Yin Yang spat and squinted at Venerable Lord Sword, speaking in a sarcastic tone. Venerable Lord Sword, you're also a reputable figure in the world. How dare you say that you want to challenge me, a mere 18.5 years old. What a heroic move, what a heroic bearing. If I win, I'll be able to go over. What a generous condition. Venerable Lord Sword's pale face flushed crimson. Yin Yang's tongue was as sharp as a knife, each word cutting into one's heart. If I can defeat you, Venerable Lord Sword, I'll just fight my way through. Is there a need to waste so much time talking to you? Yin Yang was still jabbering incessantly. All right, you're not giving way, are you? Not giving way, are you? I'll ask again, not giving way, are you? Fine, I'll go. I'll leave now, goodbye. He turned to leave after he said that. With a whistle, Reddy galloped over from afar. Yin Yang leaped onto the horse and muttered to himself. Puffed. Top expert of the top sect? You know we're not acquaintances, yet you're doing this and that. You don't even want a little bit of shamelessness. What's there for your father to say? Your father won't entertain you anymore. Go. Wait. Venerable Lord Snow frowned for a long time before he finally waved his hand. Young Master Yin, you don't have to scold us like this. We'll let you pass. However, after today, we don't know each other anymore. Chapter 495. Yin Yang snorted, but his expression was unforgiving as he said, What are you talking about? What are you talking about? Whatever the initial promise is, it's what it is. What right do you have to let me go? And we don't owe each other anything. I won't agree to it. Anyone with a brain wouldn't agree to it. I really don't know if you're too smart or too stupid to actually come up with such a ridiculous argument. If you really want to be punished by heaven, continue to agree to the idea that we don't owe each other anything and see how heavens will judges it. What's the saying? Good and evil will always be reincarnated. Who will heaven spare? The Four Seasons Tower is so domineering, maybe heaven's punishment won't be directed at you. Why don't you try it? The four venerable ones were so angry that one Buddha was born and two Buddhas were in nirvana. The order we received was that the living were not to enter, and those who trespass would die. Not only did we not kill you, we even let you pass. This is already a great favor, all right? It's enough to sever the previous karma. Yet this child was still so unforgiving. He really did not know what was good for him. However, the four venerable lords could not do anything to him. Back then, he had indeed made this promise. If he was willing to return the favor unilaterally, it was only his own business. If the other party didn't agree to it, then it wouldn't be over. He had his own reasons and freedom, and there was no way to argue about this. What do you think? I'm right, aren't I? At the end of the day, you all owe me. Even if you let me pass, you still owe me. Farewell. Yun Yang continued to grumble as he mounted his horse with an indignant expression. With a whistle he galloped away. The sound of the horse's hooves was like a storm as it traveled far away, galloping towards the direction of the Fortress of Resilience. The Four Seasons Tower's men looked at each other, feeling fortunate that their stomachs had yet to explode. Those experts who had never been to Tiantang City were glaring at Venerable Lord Sword and the other three Venerable Lords with angry eyes. For Venerable Lords, what is going on today? Can you be any more ridiculous? That's right, we've been scolded for no reason at all. But we can't even talk back. This has really broadened our horizons. Why did you guys make such a vow when you had nothing better to do? Do you have nothing better to do? Today is really frustrating. I've never been so frustrated in my entire life. It's just a kid who's still wet behind the ears. This is really infuriating. This is the first time in my life that I've swallowed my anger and humiliation. And it's because of a junior. Everyone expressed their dissatisfaction, very dissatisfaction. You have no idea. Venerable Lord Snow heaved a long sigh. There was a reason for it back then. Our lives were hanging by a thread. We had no choice but to compromise. Sigh, if it wasn't for the lives of our brothers, who would be willing to do this? Do you think we're willing to do this today? Venerable Lord Frost held his breath and said, I have to say, this kid is really a weirdo. He's obviously from a noble family, the heir of a royal family, yet he won't let go of someone else's weakness? You keep talking about what you've promised, what you've promised, what you've promised, what you've said. You've been relentlessly pursuing and pestering him. It's really unfortunate to meet someone like this. Venerable Lord Ice continued coldly. It looks like you've missed something in this child's information. It's true that he's from a noble family, the heir of a royal family, but he also has a popular nickname, the head of the three popinjays in Tiantang City. His reputation is not just for show. Such a popinjay's temperament is true to his name. If we cross paths again in the future, I'm afraid similar situations will be unavoidable. The people around him looked at each other and said, Huh? Does this mean that the Four Seasons Tower's people will have to avoid him in the future when they see him? Otherwise, we'll have to be threatened by him? Venerable Lord Frost sighed. Venerable Lord Snow sighed. The group was speechless. What the F***ck is this? Even Ling Xiaozui has never been treated like this. Yun Yang galloped all the way, inwardly rejoicing that he had finally passed this hurdle. Apart from rejoicing, there was only anxiety in his heart. Fortress of Resilience, Old Marshal Qiu Fu Baogua, you must hang in there. Fu Baogua, you swore to live and die with the Fortress of Resilience that day. You must fulfill your vow. You've made a solemn promise to me. You can't go back on your word. Reddy and Yun Yang were one, as if they were one entity. Both the man and the steed were like a bolt of red lightning, traversing the mountains and ridges in the forest like they were on flat ground. A single leap covered hundreds of feet. The occasional passers-by who saw the steed a moment ago had already overtaken them in the next, disappearing in the blink of an eye. Reddy had really given its all now. Its movement and speed were even better than when it was in the Horse King tournament. It seemed to feel Yun Yang's anxiety as it galloped with all its might. However, the ominous feeling in Yun Yang's heart did not diminish at all. It was impossible to get rid of. Before his eyes, there seemed to be the smoke of war and the sound of war. As long as he turned the corner of the mountain pass, the place that Yun Yang hated the most in his life would be right in front of him. Tianxian Cliff. In spite of this, Yun Yang's eyes widened as he swayed, almost falling off his horse. Looking from afar, thick smoke billowed into the sky like dark clouds that covered the sky. Yun Yang, who had been through the battlefield for a long time, could tell at a glance that such billowing smoke could only appear when the city was breached. It was the black smoke that signified the determination to perish together with the enemy. Such a scene had always been a bad omen on the battlefield, a manifestation of the most extreme situation. After galloping another 30 miles, the deafening battle cries could gradually be heard. Yun Yang leaned on the steed and exerted more force, charging out of the valley like a whirlwind. The other side was already in a state of melancholy, the sun and moon losing their luster. Crimson red filled his vision. In front of him was a vast plain that spanned thousands of miles. At this very moment, countless soldiers from both sides were committing suicide. Everywhere he looked there were people, there were soldiers everywhere. What was left was only the color of blood. Yun Yang could not help sucking in a sharp breath as he watched the current state of the battle, his heart filled with shock. Yutong had been at war all year round, surrounded by enemies from all sides. They had been at war for far too many years. Since Yutong's 9 supremes had appeared, they had gone through many battles. Despite Yun Yang's young age, he had been through hundreds of battles, and had been on the battlefield for a long time. However, it was the first time in his life that Yun Yang had encountered a war of such scale and intensity. How could a massive battle involving more than 1 million people, close to 2 million people, be taken lightly? As the saying went, when there were tens of thousands of people, there was no end to it. What if there were hundreds of thousands or millions of people? Looking from the top of the mountain, one could not see the end of it. One could only see the silhouettes in the distance getting smaller and smaller, turning into a blurry mass. However, the battle on the other side was still extremely intense, not at all inferior to what could be seen clearly here. There was only one word to describe this battle: extreme. It was the most extreme battle of the century. If another word had to be used, it could only be, this is the final battle. The ultimate battle. Yun Yang's heart tightened as he thought of this, urging his steed forward once more. It was not that Yun Yang had forgotten that he had lost his manifestation powers, and that his mystical cultivation base had yet to recover to its peak, but he could no longer hesitate or worry about anything else. As a member of the Empire of Yutong, he could only throw himself into the battlefield without hesitation. He would have no regrets in doing so. Yun Yang could clearly see that the side that had the absolute advantage now was Dongxuan's army, led by Han Sanhe. The ones who had built the defense line hastily and were holding on bitterly were Yutong's soldiers, who would rather die than retreat. At this moment, the situation had reached the most critical juncture. Yun Yang's steed galloped like a gust of wind. Just as he was about to step onto the battlefield, a deafening roar came from within the formation. The roar was filled with grief and indignation. Yun Yang, who had heard the roar, felt a wave of dizziness wash over him. Suddenly, he saw stars and fell off his horse with a loud thud, rolling a dozen times in a row. It was an extremely embarrassing fall. There was no other reason for it, only because the soldiers were howling in grief and indignation. Kill all of Dongxuan's traitors, avenge the old marshal. Old marshal? Qiu Jianhan? Yun Yang, who heard the words, was immediately thrown into a panic. In the Empire of Yutong, there had always been only one person who could be addressed as Old Marshal. Only Qiu Jianhan. There was no branch, no home. What had happened to the Old Marshal? Yun Yang, who had heard the grievous news, was horrified. He felt as if his soul had flown out of his body. Stumbling 2 steps on the ground, before he regained his consciousness. If Yun Yang had already entered the battlefield, this moment of absent-mindedness would have been enough for him to die 17 or 18 times over. Despite the shock, Yun Yang still held on to a sliver of hope. Leaping onto his steed, he charged towards the army without a care in the world. He only had one thought now: to charge over as fast as he could and ask about the situation on the other side of the formation, hoping that the old marshal was blessed with good fortune and had survived the mishap. Although there was still no news of Emmy, there was still a great chance that he could save the old marshal's life with his endless divine art. Yun Yang truly did not want to lose a close elder who cared for him. Yun Yang knew that he would not be able to withstand the repeated deaths. Get out of the way! Yun Yang, who had entered the battlefield, did not hesitate at all, activating his Heaven Realm cultivation base. Those who came close to him were either flung away with internal injuries or killed on the spot. The king of horses, ready, seemed to feel Yun Yang's urgency as well. Its already swift speed was raised to another level as it charged forward. The man and the horse were like a miniature fortress as they charged forward. For a moment no one could stop them. It only took a moment for Yun Yang to advance more than 5,000 feet. On the other side of the formation, Fu Baogua's silhouette entered Yun Yang's sight. This Yutong's marshal, who was closely related to Yun Yang, was standing in the wooden bucket on the flagpole, shouting with all his might. As he commanded the battle, he deflected the rain of arrows with the long sword in his hand. There was another person beside him. Yun Yang was surprised to see that it was Fang Mafei, who was wielding the sword in his hand to protect Fu Baogua as he sent precise orders. Fu Baogua seemed to have lost his mind. Commanding the battle from such a conspicuous position was no different from seeking death. If it were not for Fang Mafei's protection, he would have become a human-shaped porcupine long ago. However, Yun Yang could no longer care about Fu Baogua's current condition. He who had already charged into the battlefield needed to change his strategy. He could no longer charge forward with his powerful mystical qi cultivation base. What he had done earlier was indeed invincible, but the consumption was too high, and it was not conducive to a protracted battle. Yun Yang charged into the thousands of soldiers and horses. Suddenly, he extended his arm and snatched the long saber from a Dongxian general's hand. With a wave of the saber, a dozen Dongxian soldiers around him fell to the ground with agonized cries. Actually, Yun Yang had wanted to use weapons right from the start. If he had Heaven's Blade as a supplement, he could have easily charged into the battlefield and killed more enemies. However, Heaven's Blade was missing just like Emmy, making it difficult for him to participate in this battle. The red horse continued to gallop forward at an extremely fast speed without stopping. Far away, a troop of soldiers was surrounded by a large number of Dongxian soldiers. They were charging forward like mad tigers, but they could not break through Dongshuan's heavy siege. Dongshuan's soldiers were surrounding them from all directions, trying their best to devour Yutong's soldiers. On the other side, Yutong's cavalry was also charging forward like a madman, but they were forcefully intercepted by Dongshuan's shadow cavalry, who were fearless of death. If one were to say that the previous battle situation was already exceptionally tragic, then the current level of devastation was actually 2 levels higher. Save the old marshal. Avenge the old marshal. Charge over. Fu Baogua hollered like a thunderbolt in the clear sky. Charge. Charge over. You must help me get the old marshal out. Yun Yang was overjoyed, knowing that old Marshal Qiu Jianhan was still alive at this moment. It was not too late. Don't be late. Wait for me to rush over. Thinking about it, Yun Yang subconsciously diverted at least 30% of his attention to the commotion over there. There was a faint white silhouette circling rapidly, charging forward. Wherever the white silhouette passed, Dongshuan's soldiers fell in batches and batches. There was no one who could withstand the white silhouette. Wherever the silhouette passed, blood splattered like it was free. In spite of this, the space he had just cleared was instantly filled with Dongshuan's troops once again. It was Bai Yixue who was already one of the world's pinnacle experts. It was obvious that the old marshal was still alive, because of Bai Yixue's protection. If it were not for such a strong support, the old marshal would have long passed away. In spite of Baishiwa's unparalleled prowess, unstoppable on the battlefield, and able to take on an army of 1,000, it was still impossible for him to bring the old marshal out safely. Baishiwa! Yin Yang roared when he saw the situation. Baishiwa had been fighting for a long time, and was about to reach his limit. If his mystical chi was depleted to its limit, he would not be able to escape death even with his profound cultivation base. Yet when he heard the roar, he was energized as he hollered, "Young master! I'm here!" The sword light, which had been gradually dimming and converging, suddenly surged and soared into the sky. Then, a sword light fell from the sky, directly killing all the enemies within a radius of 10 feet. However, this moment of glory was still unable to intimidate the enemies, and in a moment, they were drowned by the tide of people. This gap was enough for Yin Yang to ascertain his direction. With another roar, he waved the saber in his hand and hollered, "Those who stand in my way shall die." Clamping his legs on the horse's abdomen, Reddy let out a long neigh and charged out like a ray of red light along with its horse. Before the red light was the saber energy of the saber, that had also turned into a cold gleam. Leveraging on the horse's momentum, the man charged into the steel cavalry's formation in no time at all. The steel cavalry was engaged in an intense battle with the shadow cavalry when they heard the sound of a horn behind them. It was in order to split up and make way for them. Before the men could snap out of their daze and make way, they heard a loud roar. "Brothers in front, out of the way!" The roar carried a sense of authority. Those who heard it could not help but turn their bodies sideways and move their horses' heads. Almost at the same time, the long neigh of a warhorse rang out. It was unimaginably sonorous and sonorous. Then he saw a red blur flash past him at high speed. With a whoosh, it had already charged out of the front of his steel cavalry formation, crashing into the shadow cavalry formation on the other side. Then there was a sudden crash, and all he could see was the shadow cavalry on the other side falling over. Streams of blood spurted upwards, and their heads rolled all over the ground like a watermelon cart that had been overturned. In the blink of an eye, hundreds of the shadow cavalry had fallen. A straight path of blood and corpses appeared before their eyes. On both sides, there were many shadow cavalry, all of them looking shocked as they stared at their hands in disbelief. Their sabers and spears, no matter what weapons they were no longer in their hands. The only thing they felt was a jolt in their hands. Before they could even see the other party's shadow, their weapons had flown out of their hands. What was left was only their hands that were dripping with blood. 2 days into one. There were some things that had yet to be thought through. Today was only the beginning. Chapter 496. While Yutong's steel cavalry was surprised and overjoyed, they could still see that the crimson trail of blood was still extending in front of them. The red horse was galloping with its head held high, while the purple silhouette was unstoppable. Wherever it passed, rows of human heads would fly into the air, spinning in the air. The shadow cavalry that was like an unbreakable line of defense could not be stopped, not even in the blink of an eye, by the man and his steed. The other party was like an extremely sharp long saber, while the shadow cavalry was like a soft piece of butter. Wherever the saber passed, there was no resistance. It was as if he could cut from one end to the other with a casual swing of his saber. The commander of the Black Knights, who had also witnessed everything, could not help but suck in a breath of cold air. He felt a chill rising from the bottom of his heart. In an instant his entire body felt cold. It was as if that person's cold blade had already swept past his neck. Still in shock, he cried out involuntarily, "There's actually such a person in this world. Who is this person?" The group looked at each other speechless. No one answered. No matter how knowledgeable one was, they could not connect this person, who had broken through so forcefully, with a certain someone in their memory. Not to mention that this was not the impression that the person had given the public. The only thing the shadow cavalry knew was that they had seen a purple silhouette riding on a red steed, sweeping past them. They could only see the gleam of the saber, as their comrades fell one after another. They could only see the other party, leaving in a cloud of dust as he massacred them. They could not even see his face clearly. He looks like he's very young. One of the shadow cavalry marshal's hands was empty, blood dripping from his perlicue as the corners of his lips twitched. He felt like he had just been through the gates of hell 4 to 5 times. He, who had always been bold and did not care about life and death, was actually feeling weak all over. He had been lucky to be at the periphery of the fiend's breach just now. He had only managed to pass his saber in time, before he was flung away. It was as if he had been struck by lightning, but he had managed to keep his life. If he had gone a little further in just now, his body that had been growing for more than 30 years would have been lying on the ground in tatters. It turned out that even though he said that he didn't care about life and death, when he really faced a life and death situation, he was still afraid. This was how things were in the world. Everyone was afraid of death. The only difference was whether their death was worth it or not. There were grudges and no grudges, and there were regrets. That was all. Very young. The commander of the Black Knights frowned. A very young and powerful Shioja? Who is that? Yin Yang charged forward like a hot knife through butter, sweeping away all who stood in his way. At this moment, he did not even consider whether his spiritual essence and mystical chi could keep up, nor did he consider anything else. He could only focus on charging forward. There was only one thing on his mind. How is old Marshal Qiu? Did he still have a breath of life left in him? It was at this moment that dozens of beams of sword light attacked from the other end. The sword energy actually sent chills down Yin Yang's spine. At the same time, hundreds of people gathered here from all directions. Experts. Yin Yang understood immediately. The old marshal had Bai Yixue, a pinnacle expert of this world, protecting and assisting him, but he still could not break out of the encirclement and was in a precarious situation. It was obvious that Dongxian had gathered a large number of experts as well. Even if their top-notch combat power was not up to par, they could still wear you down with sheer numbers. This was a sure-win tactic on the battlefield. Currently, there were about 700 people who had come to stop him. On the other side, Bai Yixue was still surrounded by a dense crowd. At a glance, there were at least thousands of people fighting with all their might. Bai Yixue was breaking out of the encirclement in an unusually frenzied manner. The sword in his hand was like a raging dragon. There were people injured and dismembered by his sword. However, there was always a large number of people who came forward to stop him, delaying Bai Yixue's progress to the maximum. At this moment, there was another person who was moving forward with Bai Yixue. This person was tall and graceful, with a square face and thick eyebrows. Even in the midst of such an intense battle, his every movement and every move was accompanied by a sense of ease and composure, as if he was taking a stroll in the park. It was his cheapskate father, Marquis of Heavenly Clouds Yun Xiaorao. As the two of them combined their swords, they formed a shining curtain of light that seemed to be solid. This curtain of light was also the vanguard that charged out from the densely packed enemy troops. Anyone who came into contact with it would either have their limbs torn to shreds, or their entire body would be torn to shreds, and they would die in pieces. Behind both of them were the 4 great young masters of spring, summer, autumn, and winter. These 4 young masters were dressed in the uniform of a lowly soldier. Their mouths were askew, their eyes were slanted, their faces drenched in sweat, and they were swinging their sabers and swords madly as they followed the 2 swordsmen in front of them. Naturally, the ones who were putting in the most effort were their guards, who were already panting and struggling to move. Seeing the purple figure over there, although they couldn't see it clearly from afar, the 4 fellows were already ecstatic. They shouted in unison, "Boss! Bossa helpa!" Before their words echoed in the air, they were already stopped by a delicate reprimand. "What are you shouting for? How embarrassing! You're all men asking for help, and you're from spring, summer, autumn, and winter." The 4 young masters were speechless, their faces filled with grievance. Ever since they were forcefully pulled into the military, they had been struggling with life and death every day. They had had enough of such days. They even had to ask for leave to take a piss or fart. Was this the life of a human? Now that it was a matter of life and death, what's wrong with me shouting for help? What's wrong with that? What's wrong with me wanting to ask? However, looking at Ji Lingxi and Yurilon's icy, disdainful gazes. No one dared to ask the question. The main force on the other side was Shangguan Lingxiu, Ji Lingxi, Yu Rulan, and the rest. The three ladies led the experts and valiant generals of the Shangguan family of generals, mustering their remaining strength to fight the enemy as they advanced. At this moment, seeing the purple-robed silhouette coming from afar, the three women's eyes lit up. Shangguan Lingxiu's clear cry rang through the air. "Young Master Yin, the old marshal is here, come quickly." Yu Rulan and Ji Lingxi did not forget to roll their eyes in the midst of their battle. "I'm so affectionate." She glared at the purple silhouette who was cutting through the waves and gritted her teeth, thinking, "This bastard actually appeared at this time. I'll deal with you when we get out of here." In the middle of the group were the Shangguan clan's private army and several thousand iron cavalry soldiers. They were in an orderly formation, and this group was led by the Iron Cavalry's commander, Wang Dinghua. All of these soldiers had grief and indignation on their faces, and their bodies were covered with wounds. Every single one of them was drenched in blood. Other than that, there was no other color. There was only crimson on them. Their own blood, the blood of their comrades, and the blood of their enemies. Before Yunyang arrived, he would never have thought that so many of his acquaintances would be gathered here. No, it should be said that most of his acquaintances from the eastern border were here. Thinking of this, Yin Yang's thoughts grew heavier. In all fairness, the high-end forces on his side were already so strong that it made one's hair stand on end. Excluding himself, there were still Bai Yixue, Fang Mafei, and Yin Xiaoyao, the three Heaven Realm experts, the four noble young masters who had benefited from Yin Yang's spiritual medicine and their guards. Each of them had an extraordinary cultivation base and could be considered the cream of the crop. Although Ji Lingxi and Yu Rulan's cultivation base had yet to reach the Heaven Realm, they were already close to the perfection of the peak realm. Even if Shangguan Lingxiu and the Shangguan family's private army had a slightly weaker cultivation base, they were still battle-hardened gods of death. Their lethality was not lacking. In addition, there were famed marshals like Qiu Jianhan and Fu Baoguo watching over them. Their combined ability could not be said to be weak. It could even be extremely strong. In spite of this, the current situation was still so dire. One could only imagine how strong the forces on Han Sanha's side were. It was definitely not something that could be achieved by merely having a superior military force. The martial world experts that could not be seen must be a terrifying number as well. Yunyang focused his gaze and saw that in the middle of Yutong's breakout troop, everyone was protecting a black carriage with all their might. The small carriage was unusually eye-catching, swaying in the midst of the enemy's camp like a small boat that could capsize at any time in a raging sea, bobbing up and down amidst the endless waves. The Dongxian troops around the carriage were in a frenzy. They were like hungry wolves that had seen fresh meat, charging forward without a care for their own lives. Even when they knew that they would be facing the sharp sabers and swords of several experts, they were fearless in the face of death. Once a batch died, another batch would take its place, and there would only be more of them than before, even more ferocious. Furthermore, there were countless arrows coming from all directions, and they were pouring down on him without a moment's pause. Wherever the carriage went, the sky would be blanketed by arrows. They were densely packed, endless and endless. They were just arrows, but they had created the feeling of a surging river that flowed endlessly. One could imagine how ferocious and densely packed the incoming arrows were. Other than that, there were many Dongxian experts who appeared anytime and anywhere under the cover of the troops, causing a considerable amount of damage. Almost every few moments, there would be dozens or even hundreds of experts charging towards the black carriage with their lives on the line. Amidst Dongshuan's formation, the horns were blaring incessantly. It was in order to urge the soldiers to charge forward and kill the enemy. Amidst such a frenzied attack, he still had to issue the order to urge them on. It was evident how determined Han Sanha was to capture the person in the black carriage and not give up. Who was in the carriage? The question had long been answered. There was no need to answer it. Other than Qiu Jianhan, there was probably no one else in this world who could garner such attention from Han Sanha. Despite the dire situation, old Marshal Qiu did not come out. He was in the carriage. If he still had the slightest bit of strength left, he would not be so silent. Countless Dongxian soldiers and Dongxian generals were shouting with all their might. Capture Qiu Jianhan alive, 1,000,000 taels of gold, thousands of acres of fertile land, and be made a marquis of 10,000 households. Those who behead Qiu Jianhan will be awarded 1,000,000 taels of gold, and be made a marquis of 10,000 households. Those who have sacrificed themselves in this battle will be compensated tenfold. Their children will be sent to school until they grow up. The military will subsidize them. Their third generation will be exempted from taxes, crimes, and military service. Capture Qiu Jianhan alive. Capture Qiu Jianhan alive. There will be a chapter later. I've been writing slowly these 2 days not because I'm stuck in the plot, but because I've been considering life and death. Would it be life or death? I can't make up my mind about this. On the other hand, writing about living and writing about dying both required a large amount of plot development, but they were completely opposite. Chapter 497. Dong Xuan's tactic was obvious. It was simple and direct, but it was effective. Qiu Jianhan had to die even if they had to sacrifice their lives. They would not allow Qiu Jianhan, who had fallen to such a state, to have any chance of survival. Great benefits, great reputation, great benefits, and great compensation. As long as they died or were sacrificed in this battle, there would be endless benefits for their descendants to enjoy, who would not fight to the death. What was more, the enforcement team's gleaming steel sabers were right behind them. Death was inevitable if they went forward, but there was still a chance for them to make a great contribution. Even if they died, there would still be great benefits. It would be worth it no matter how one looked at it. On the other hand, if they hesitated and took half a step back, they would be charged with treason. Not only would they deserve to die, they would also go down in infamy. Yun Yang set his target and howled again. Those who stand in my way shall die. Like a mad tiger, he charged towards the densest group of people. At this moment, the long saber that had already been curled up, because of the continuous slashes, moved again. It suddenly swung out a stream of blood beads, drawing a semicircle in the crowd. Bang, bang, bang. Wherever the saber passed, countless experts of the Jianghu cried out in shock when they came into contact with this enormous power, and were sent flying. Among them, there were even more people who were flying in the air when their bodies suddenly split into pieces, and they died on the spot. Yun Yang and his steed charged forward like a giant ship crossing the surface of the water, forcefully carving out a clear blood-colored dividing line. Wherever he passed, there were corpses strewn all over the ground. There was no sign of life. Along the way, there were millions of soldiers and countless experts, but none of them could stop him, not even for a blink of an eye. Right now, Yun Yang was like a bolt of lightning, charging towards Qiu Jianhan's remaining troops, who were surrounded by a dense crowd. If Yun Yang had been anxious earlier, he had gone berserk now. Not only did he know that old Marshal Qiu, Bai Yixue, the four popinjays Ji Lingxi, Yu Rulan, and Shengguan Lingxiu were there, as well as his nominal father, Marquis of Heavenly Clouds Yun Xiaoyao. Not only did Yun Yang not want to lose old Marshal Qiu, all of these people were his closest friends and family. He could not lose them. He could not lose them. Moreover, the other party's attacks were so crazy that the other side was like a small boat in a raging sea that could capsize at any time. Therefore, Yun Yang's combat power was off the charts at this moment. He was like a god of death who had descended into the world unrivaled. On the other side, Zhang Ge, who was also commanding the battle from a high vantage point, naturally noticed the anomaly on the battlefield at the first instant. It was the terrifying figure that had split his army apart like a bolt of lightning. Zhang Ge was Han Sanhe's disciple, the heir to his legacy. Naturally, he was well versed in the art of war. He could sense that something was amiss at once. He immediately issued an order. Mutual perishing tactic. Broken jade tactic. Deal with the purple-clothed man, with the same method you used against the white-clothed man. Yutong's Eastern army had their own price tag. Qiu Jianhan was naturally at the top, followed by Fu Baogua and Bai Yixue. Initially, it was because of Bai Yixue's past. He was the culprit who had caused Han Sanha to be pursued and obstructed during his return journey. Now that they had met again, Han Sanha was more cautious and more intent to kill. However, when they actually met, Dongshuan's ace cultivators had swiftly reported that it was better not to provoke this person if possible. This person's ability had greatly exceeded their knowledge. Normal tactics were meaningless against him. They would only be sending their lives to their graves. Han Sanha had re-evaluated Bai Yixue because of this, even ordering them to relax their attacks on this person. It was fine even if they let him escape unscathed. After all, Bai Yixue was not a high-ranking member of Yutong's military. It would be futile even if he was let go. In spite of this, Bai Yixue had stayed by Qiu Jianhan's side to protect him, never leaving him like a shadow. It could be said that to kill Qiu Jianhan, one had to kill Bai Yixue first. After a series of twists and turns, the final conclusion was that Bai Yixue had to be killed. No matter how difficult it was to kill him, he had to be killed. In fact, if old Marshal Qiu's remaining troops did not have Bai Yixue's support, they would have collapsed a long time ago. It was also because of this that Bai Yixue had attracted more than half of Dongshuan's ace combat power. Although he had killed countless men, he had also exhausted himself to the point of exhaustion. Right now, he could only maintain the combination of swords with Yun Xiaoyao to maintain the last line of defense. Yun Yang's sudden emergence had replaced Bai Yixue and attracted Zhang Jiyi's attention. Zhang Ge was a famous general in the battlefield, but his knowledge of the differences between cultivation experts was limited. He had overestimated Yun Yang by placing him on the same level as Bai Yixue. In spite of this, Yun Yang's ferocious demeanor of killing gods was much more ferocious than Bai Yixue. At least in terms of aura, Bai Yixue paled in comparison to this young master Yun. In spite of this was indeed Zhang Jiyi's heartfelt wish. There must not be another white-clothed reaper, nor could he be allowed to meet with Qiu Jianhan's remaining troops. He must be killed before both parties converged. Push the war drums again, put in more effort. End this battle as soon as possible. I want to see Qiu Jianhan's head. Zhang Ge shouted excitedly. He did not notice the strange expression that flitted across Han Sanha's face, who was resting not far behind him. It was as if he was sighing, as if he was lamenting. Following Zhang Jiyi's command, all the bugles in Dongshuan's army rang loudly at the same time. It was only a moment's difference before all the war drums began to beat loudly as well. It was rapid and relentless, as if they were going to keep blowing and beating like this. At that moment, the entire battlefield was like a massive mythical beast that had been awakened by the series of noises. Its heart pounded violently, causing the blood in its body to burn fiercely. The eyes of Dongshuan's troops were suddenly bloodshot. Perishing together. It's perishing together again. A Dongxian general stood straight on the back of a galloping horse and howled into the sky, his voice shrill and heroic. Perishing together. Are they activating the perishing together again? Countless Dongxian soldiers who had been enlightened seemed to have turned into frenzied beasts, unleashing their ferocity in unison. At this moment, all thoughts of retreat, death, glory, everything was wiped away by the war drums. The deafening bugles were sounding the call of death, or perhaps it was the Grim Reaper's sonata. This was Dongshuan's second perishing together. It was the same tactic that had previously restrained Bai Yixue's forceful breakout and limited him to the current dire situation. Now it was being used for the second time, and it was targeted at Yun Yang. Yun Yang felt the resistance of his advance increase abruptly, many times more. Countless Dongxian soldiers on the path ahead were pouncing towards him, with no regard for their own lives. He was no longer using weapons, techniques, or the orthodox way of fighting on the battlefield to stop him. Instead, he was using his own body and his horse to ram into him, using his own life as an obstacle. That level of madness was truly disregarding life and death. It was no longer sufficient to describe the current method as disregarding life and death. This was because there was no longer any thought of life and death in the minds of those who tried to stop him. They only wanted to stop him. The army on both sides of Yun Yang were gathering towards the center, or perhaps they were squeezed together. Those who were closer to the front would be pushed to Yun Yang by their comrades, who were charging towards him, even if they did not charge forward themselves. What kind of charge could continue in this world when faced with such a strong force and interception? In the blink of an eye, Yin Yang's front, back, left, and right were filled with such a frenzied crowd. No matter which direction he looked in, there was an endless sea of people, a sea of human heads. Under such a frenzied and extreme attack, the troops who were escorting Qiu Jianhan were actually stopped in their tracks, and were even pushed back thousands of feet. Even when Bai Yixue tried his best to deal with them, he was still forced to retreat. There was a limit to one's strength. Even the pinnacle experts of this world could only sigh helplessly when faced with such a human wave tactic and all-out attack. Yun Yang finally understood Bai Yixue's helplessness. His saber was swung again and again, clearing the path ahead, but in the blink of an eye, the path ahead would be filled up again, making it impossible for him to move forward again. Human wave tactic had always been the last resort to deal with superior experts. At the same time, it was also the most effective method. Even if one was amazing and capable, even if one could kill 100, 1,000, or even 10,000 people, he still had 100,000 people, 1,000,000 people. Even if they stood there and let him kill them, he could still exhaust himself until he couldn't even lift his saber in the end. Even if he was tired, he would die of exhaustion. What was more, there were still quite a number of experts among those who had joined the battle. Even if these experts were far weaker than Yun Yang and could not afford to face him head-on, their combined strength would still be of some use. Even if Yun Yang were to be sliced into pieces, if he were to slice through too many bones during the process, hard bones at that, it would exhaust him even more. Just as Yun Yang was about to be engulfed by the swarm of soldiers, the saber in Yin Yang's hand left his grip and spun to form a glowing circle of light. It bloomed everywhere, slicing hundreds of people around Yun Yang in half at once. The impenetrable space cleared up abruptly. Almost at the same time, Yun Yang's right hand reached out, and another gleaming saber appeared in his hand. The tossing and grabbing were done without pause, as smooth as flowing water. Seeing that the pressure around it was gone, Reddy charged forward, its hind hooves landing on the heads of two enemy soldiers at the same time. As its feet landed, the brains of the two heads burst. Reddy, who had borrowed the momentum, had already leaped hundreds of feet away. When it landed, it continued its previous move, charging another 100 feet away. When it landed for the third time, it was unable to leap again, falling into another dense encirclement of the enemy soldiers. Dongshuan's army was made up of veterans who were used to fighting. Even when Reddy had succeeded once or twice, and escaped once or twice, how could they not make a move? On the other side, Bai Yixue and the rest, seeing Yin Yang's rise, mustered their remaining strength and fought to their heart's content, charging over as fast as they could. It was obvious that they wanted to meet up with Yin Yang and work together to break out of the encirclement and break the stalemate. Both sides were approaching each other swiftly. It was at this delicate juncture that silhouettes flashed within Dongshuan's formation. Dozens of people dressed in hemp garments and tall crowns appeared abruptly, each of them holding a strangely shaped one-handed hook that gleamed with a cold gleam. The dozens of people moved together, swiftly forming an odd formation. It was only a short exchange, but they had already completely suppressed Bai Yixue and the rest's attack. You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Sword of Destiny YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.